Check, check. Hello. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna start everything over.
Okay. My fellow Estorians, I'm Aziz, with me is Ashara, and this is Valar Rereadis. A Dance with Dragons is the longest of the books so far. It's also the darkest and least understood, thanks to being the most recent. It's the culmination, so far, of George's style, honed over the course of the prior books and the rest of his career. It's got the extended length of A Storm of Swords, the expanded pacing of A Feast for Crows, bringing POVs together like a Clash of Kings, with the setup of a Game of Thrones. If you're watching live, feel free to ask live questions or send them in advance. Discuss the chapters and topics before the episode hits on Facebook, Flick, Discord, or Slack. That's going to continue to be the case after Valar Rereadis. Different topics, different things, but same places to discuss them. Of course, I point that out because we're pretty close to the end of the main portion of Valar Rereadis, meaning the A Song of Ice and Fire portion. But of course, we're going to have the Winds of Winter, we're going to have Dunk and Egg, we're going to have Fire and Blood, we're going to have the World of Ice and Fire. We've got plenty of other things to cover, and we're going to do that. And then eventually, of course, we'll have the full Winds of Winter, and that'll be, well, a whole lot more. Check out the Isle of Faces podcast on Joe Buckley's show. That's Scraps and Scrolls. If you want more Valar Rereadis, well, that is a fantastic place to go. Joe's style is a little different than ours. He covers things from a different angle. That's a great thing. You get different takes, different looks, different thoughts. But some of those thoughts you will find in our episodes as well, because he is a co-writer for us. Same goes for Nina Friel. You can find her work on Tumblr, Good Queen Alley with one L. Lots of additional topics. She expands on some things that we talk about. A lot of historical rabbit holes, historical comparisons. Really good stuff. I highly recommend if you haven't checked out, or if you have and it's been a while, then check it out again. A couple of y'all sending some love before we get started here. Brand Winslow sends a super chat, says, Happy Valentine's Day. That's right. Valentine's Day is today. Happens to be the day we're recording. It works out that way. He says, thanks for everything that you guys do for the community. Appreciate that, Brand. And if any of you all are interested in getting involved in our audio project, if you're hearing this later, if it's been months since this episode is published, then you might want to go listen to our Winds of Winter audio productions that are being started right around now. And if you're listening to this when it's fairly new, well, then head over to one of our social media platforms and see if you'd like to participate. We've got over 100 voices to cast. There's a lot of characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, so I guess that's not too surprising, is it? Adam Hug sends a super chat, says, it's Sunday, and that means one thing, Valar Rereadis. Y'all are awesome. Thanks for creating such great content for the fandom. Thank you for the support, Adam. We appreciate it very much. And Maura Lee says, Happy Valentine's Day to you, Aziz, Shea, and everyone in the chat. So glad to be off today so that I can enjoy the stream with you all. Well, that's excellent. We're glad you have the day off as well. Good day to have off. Hopefully we can deliver some excellent fun via George R. Martin today. Lady Leaf says, nice shirt, Aziz. Is it available at sanrixian.threadless.com? I believe it is. I got this quite a while ago. This is a Sanrixian shirt, the blue rose. I thought was appropriate for Valentine's Day. Liana action. And, well, I do believe it is. Like I said, this one's a little older. I've had it for a while, but I think that one and all the others are there. She has a lot of shirts available. Boy, I couldn't possibly list them all. Just the ones I have. I have a Stark one. I have the Valarian one. I have the Greyjoy one. There's a lot of good ones, though, y'all. Definitely go check that out. Our chapters today It's our last batch of 4. Next week it's 3. Tyrion 12, a cacophony of contracts, aka setting the stage for the Second Sons to switch sides.
The Kingbreaker, the coup that killed Khrazz, aka the eyes of Ashara Dayne.
The Dragontamer, the gang does not steal a dragon, aka the one with the Burninating.
And John 11 and John 13, Dark Wings, Pink Words, aka the one with the Stabbening.
Unlucky number 11.
Yeah,
13.
that's why I didn't want to say it.
So yeah, this episode, as the super chat from Bran Winslow indicated, this episode is recording on Valentine's Day, and that means I'm going to start off with some bad jokes. Of course. Barristan still carries a torch for Ashara while thinking of Lyanna and Rhaegar. He was always too shy with her, but not with Khrazz. After the pit fighter promises to eat his heart, Barristan boldly pierces his. And who is that new lover in Hizdar's bed everyone is bugging out over? I bet she's spicy and sweet. Quentyn puts on a mask to surprise Viserion, but it's Rhaegal who sets his heart afire. The rest of him, too. Garrett Kingsblood is dressed to impress for the Bachelor Freefolk edition. Who will he give his blue rose to? Sir Patrick tries to win the love of Val and Tyne, but he runs into a giant problem and is all torn up about it. Tyrion must be feeling romantic. He signs about 100 love letters to the Second Sons while promising them countless gold coins, but it's a single penny on his mind. Jon's friends surround him to reveal up close just how much they love him, but only after a pink letter arrives from an anonymous sender. Who is the secret admirer? Okay, enough of that. Several characters and factions can wait no longer. Things have come to a head, and difficult decisions must be made. The reality of the situation cannot be denied, though several do have trouble coming to grips with it. Whether it's a small-scale example like Penny refusing to acknowledge the danger they're in and how bad it was with Yezan despite being one of his favorites. Jon realizes his officers are just not going to come around on working with the Free Folk, and his officers have decided they've had enough of that and other things, and they have at last found an opportunity to stop him from making more decisions that they violently disagree with. Quentyn never really does acknowledge the reality of how bad his plan is, how doomed it is. He's even slow to catch on to the fact that he's caught on fire. But pretty much everyone else tells him what a bad idea it is. They're not in denial. Barristan confronts Hizdahr after seeing no other options and realizing that time is running short. And it culminates, in harmony with Quentyn, in an Azor Ahai-themed climax. Then, after 3 chapters in a row at Meereen, Jon has an Azor Ahai scene of his own. 3 of the chapters have scenes in armories, and the other has heat far greater than any forge. All of the chapters today have an extra dose of historical rabbit holes. And aside from the Azor Ahai themes, the rest are all somewhat recent history. Basically 20 to 120 years ago. And these stories intertwine in some very fun ways. What I'm about to say could also be seen as an homage of sorts to the greatness of George's ability to weave the history of his world into the narrative. Tyrion's chapter is well placed as it delves into the history of the Second Sons, setting the stage for several other chapters that delve into similar histories. A lot of evocative names over the past century that have served in the Second Son serve as that springboard for these rich backstories. Let's start with Roderick Stark, the Wandering Wolf. He was the 7th of 7 children, 5th of 5 boys, younger brother of Artos the Implacable and Lord Willem Stark. Willem is Jon Snow's great-great-grandfather, and he was slain at the Battle of Long Lake about 75 years ago, referenced in Jon's chapter in a conversation with Tormund when they speak of kings beyond the wall. It was none other than Garrett Kingsblood's ancestor Raymond Redbeard, who slew Lord Willem Stark, only to himself be slain in turn by Artos the Implacable. Roderick the Wandering Wolf, being their younger brother, was probably too young to have fought in that battle himself, though it's possible, or maybe he was there as a squire or something like that. Roderick later married a Flint named Arya, and since this is Ned's grandmother, he probably named his daughter for her in particular. The Wandering Wolf's daughter, Liara, married Rickard Stark, making the current Starks all doubly related to the Wandering Wolf, meaning both sides. Lord Rickard was burned to death by the Mother of Dragons' dad, King Aerys II, while Barristan and Jaime and Brandon Stark and others whose names come up today were made to watch. Aerys is Quentin's great uncle, and today Barristan is close by as Quentin Burns, thanks to a real dragon named after Aerys' son. Well, that's confusing, isn't it? But it all comes together. Would Quentin have made this journey at all if Aerys hadn't burned Rickard, which in turn led to the rebellion and thus the death of his Aunt Elia? Not to mention his niece Rhaenys and nephew Aegon. And of course, a probably fake version of that nephew Aegon, who might actually be a descendant of the Blackfires, is in play. Which brings us to another name mentioned in the roles of the Second Sons, as well as in Barristan's chapter he gets named, and that's Bittersteel, who seems to have taken what he learned with his 1 year in the Second Sons, and parlayed that experience into his own sellsword company, the Golden Company. Bittersteel, a.k.a. Aegor Rivers, was the son of Aegon IV, who is mentioned in Quentin's chapter. After the death of Daemon Blackfyre, it was Bittersteel, Daemon's half-brother, who became the head of the Blackfyre family. And of course, it was Barristan who ended the male line of Blackfyres by cutting his way through the Golden Company to kill Maelys the Monstrous of the Nine Penny Kings. Thus, we are reminded that in today's chapter, the Kingbreaker, well, it's not his first time breaking a king or a would-be king. Now, Bittersteel was dead by the time Maelys was killed, but perhaps the Wandering Wolf was still around? We don't know. His story has some holes in it. Now, he was no king except perhaps in the pit, but Khrazz was broken by the Kingbreaker as well, or is today. His story ends with some holes in it too, but really not metaphorical ones. Literal ones left by Barristan's longsword. Barristan is one of the Mother Dragons' champions, and most of his career has been in service to House Targaryen. Khrazz fittingly dies amidst blood and fire, just as the dragons are being loosed by Dornish and a different company of sellswords. There's lots of sellswords today. The Second Sons, of course, we've already mentioned them. But prior to Brown Ben Plum, they were most recently led by Mero of Braavos, as you recall. The Titan's bastard was his nickname. And, well, Barristan killed him, too. So he's done for multiple would-be kings and multiple sellsword company captains. Barristan is a rare example of many things. Another being that he was not a second son, but an actual heir who gave up his inheritance to wear the white cloak. Something he has in common with Jaime, though that doesn't get spoken of too often. But had he not joined, he would have become a Marcher Lord. The Marches are a historically warlike region, as the Marches are essentially the places that share borders with Dorne. It's somewhat ironic, then, that it was the Marcher Lords who were among the biggest supporters of the Blackfyre cause, as they resented Daeron the Good's forced peace with Sunspear. Daemon Blackfyre also resented the marriage of Daenerys Targaryen, Daeron's daughter, to Meryn Martell, and that marriage produced the line that Quentin belongs to. Arch and Quentin's friendship is notable too, as their families were on opposite sides of the Blackfyre rebellions, and that wasn't that long ago. It is said the Ironwoods rode with Bittersteel 3 separate times, not to mention many conflicts between Ironwood and Martell in generations past. That goes back a long way. Selmy is serving as Queen's Hand, but he's also a Lord Commander, and his counterpart, Lord Commander on the Wall, is slain as well, temporarily, we suppose. But as Jon is stabbed by those purportedly on his side, we continue to worry that Barristan will suffer a similar fate in the next book, meaning being stabbed by people on his side. Quentin himself is no second son, but the term second son refers to inheritance rights, rather the lack of inheritance rights. And that in that regard, Quentin is effectively a second son, because in Dorne, women have equal rights to inheritance, and he's second born. So same difference. Yet another mentioned second son we can weave into this intro is Aerion Brightflame, the one who drank wildfire. Barristan's thoughts turn to Aerion's brother Egg, who became king in part because of said wildfire beverage. He was crowned Aegon V the Unlikely shortly after that. And pray recall, it was Bloodraven overseeing the great council that placed Egg on that throne, and Egg's son who gave Barristan his white cloak after Barristan slew Maelys the Monstrous. Egg's mother And, of course, Aerion Bright Flame's mother, and Maester Aemon's mother, and Daeron the Dreamer's mother, that's all the same person, was Deanna Dayne. And Barristan thinks about the Daynes today as well. As usual, that family is shrouded in mystery, and Barristan's thoughts on both Arthur and Ashara seem to deepen those mysteries as much as they explain them. That's ever the way with the Daynes, isn't it? With the mention of Ashara and Arthur and the tourney of Harrenhal, there's an awful lot in these chapters connecting us to Ned Stark. John's decisions leading to his stabbing are an awful lot like the types of decisions that Ned made that led up to his beheading. For one thing, Quentyn has a lot in common with Ned as well, especially what Ned was like at that age, the age Quentyn is now meaning. A lot of burden on him to deliver for his house, a serious person, kind of shy with girls, and narratively, Ned's death was a major surprise as well as a trope twister, and that is surely something we could say about Quentyn as well. Similar to Jon being doubly related to the Wandering Wolf, Daenerys is related to Egg through both of her parents. Furthermore, the aforementioned Willem Stark married Melantha Blackwood, while Egg married Betha Blackwood. Melantha and Betha may have been sisters. That's something we cover in our Blackwood episodes. If this were a more standard story, common themes often point to a romantic connection, and Jon and Dany may indeed have that in their future. But it probably won't end well, and that's where the trope might be inverted. Certainly, finding out your lover is a close relative is not typical. Though it's not so unusual in this world, it's not atypical in this story itself. It's a semi-regular thing in A Song of Ice and Fire, of course, but some other notable classic tropes that are broken occur today, some interesting ones worth pointing out, since we're talking about broken tropes. Quentyn, of course, is the most blatant, I would argue. His tale of adventure ended in a horribly gruesome, lingering death. I mean, he suffers for days before dying. It's not just that he dies. It's really, really bad. Though not the only hero of A Song of Ice and Fire, Jon Snow fits the heroic center role more than Quentyn by far, I think it's fair to say. Nevertheless, he too is killed, and he's killed while investigating an incident that proves to be a knight trying to steal a princess, only to be stopped by a giant. That's also quite a trope inversion, isn't it? Usually the giant steals the princess, and the knight does the rescuing, right? I think that's usually how it goes. And here in our first chapter, Tyrion tries to get Penny to see that they are not living in a story. He might be right to talk her out of that attitude, but I'm going to have to disagree with Tyrion on a technicality with regards to his claim that they're not living in a story or a song. You're in one of the greatest stories ever told, Tyrion, and it's also a song of ice and fire. Tyrion 12, a cacophony of contracts, aka setting the stage for the Second Sons to switch sides. So many ways we could have done this. A clutter of contracts, a chaos of contracts, a damnation of debts, a rant of robbery, an excess of extortion, or just what it starts with.
The pile of parchments was formidably high.
Yeah, could have just gone with pile of parchments. Yeah, okay. What is all this about? Of course, we get the answer. Gold. It's about money. We should not be surprised. We are dealing with sellswords after all. We've been told ad nauseum that that's what matters to them most. Sometimes it's exaggerated, but it's usually pretty close to the truth. It certainly is here. Brown Ben is absolutely one of these types. We've seen it from multiple angles over the course of several books. His goals are pretty straightforward, at least that particular goal, to be enriched. And it's kind of ironic going back on tying a bow on things, Tyrion doesn't actually have this money that he's promising, but he might be able to get a hold of it and pay them out, so they may as well do it. So it's an interesting way for him to continue to recapture his identity by associating him with the vast wealth of Casterly Rock that he doesn't currently have access to, but he has a claim to. Now, again, this is the thing that gives him so much power. There's no one here. We recognize he's intelligent. We do as readers, but for the most part, that's not really being acknowledged by a lot of people in the story. No one's like, oh, we follow Tyrion because he's really smart. We follow him because he's clever. No, they follow him because he's a Lannister. They smell the wealth attached to him. And that's too bad, but it is what it is. I wonder how many, if any, of these Second Sons are going to actually collect on all these contracts. I mean, yeah, it seems like a lot has to happen before that could happen, and a lot could happen to the second sons or many of them in between now and then. Of course, the part of this tale, this story here, is that not all the second sons are included in these payouts. Remember what I said about Brown Ben Plum's anecdote with the gold and the corpse and the flies and all that, and how his brothers in arms robbed him of his find when he was young? Remember what I said? I said I think maybe he was telling that story, but changed which role he was, as in he was the one taking the money from the naive kid rather than being the one who had it taken from him, so he could seem sympathetic. But anyway, whether or not I'm right about that is not super important, but it's the same attitude here, that yeah, they're family, but some people are more in the family than others. And yeah. So either way, if Ben manages to collect on this, he's going to be rich. I mean, he's already cashed in quite a lot in these parts. Switching sides made him a lot of money, got paid, walking out the door by Dany. So as long as, he's able to not get killed for doing that, then he is rich. Consider how different he's maneuvered the situation than the prior captain to the second sons, who I mentioned during the intro, Miro, the Titan's bastard, right? That guy, violent, brutal, very different. Probably the unusual example. I bet Brown Ben Plum is the more typical type of sellsword captain. Surely there's plenty of types like neither of them. But, I mean, Plum seems more like Harry Strickland to me. Right, Bloodbeard, maybe that guy's a little more like Miro, really violent and bloody, but I'm not sure even that point. So the point is, to exist for a long time, sellsword companies, you got to survive, and they're live by the sword, die by the sword, so they got to be careful. So that means not being too bold. There are old sellsword companies and bold sellsword companies, but few old, bold sellsword companies. And this is an old company, so we have to assume they haven't been too bold. And indeed, we get some history that serves to explain that to us. Here's a nice long quote about a big, huge stack of books.
The book was leather-bound with iron hinges and large enough to eat your supper off. Inside its heavy wooden boards were names and dates going back more than a century. The second sons were amongst the oldest of the free companies, Inkpot said as he was turning pages. This is the fourth book. The names of every man to serve with us are written here. When they joined, where they fought, how long they served, the manner of their deaths, all in the book. You will find famous names in here, some from your 7 kingdoms. Aegor Rivers served a year with us before he left to found the Golden Company. Bittersteel, you call him. The Bright Prince, Aerion Targaryen, he was a second son. And Roderick Stark, the Wandering Wolf, him as well.
So do the math real quick there. Inkpot says that's the 4th book and it goes back a century. So 4 books, 100 years per book roughly, 400 years old. Yep, that's about right. There are indeed verifications that they have existed at least about 400 years. That's really long. In the Chaos of the Century of Blood, it's said that they were hired by Qohor to stand against the Dothraki because the Dothraki were just starting to become a problem after the Doom. In fact, that was the first time they had come west since the Doom. Actually, the second sons ran away when this happened. Not that I blame them. I would certainly run from Dothraki too, but it didn't look good on their rolls because that is the same famous battle where those 3,000 Unsullied defeated these very same Dothraki. And they certainly did it without the help of the second sons. But hey, like I said, that's why they're still around. The Unsullied survived that, but only 600 of those 3,000. If the second sons had been with them, well, there may not be any more second sons. So this is, of course, this book. It's hard not to also think of the White Book. And the White Book is also huge and is full of bold deeds, because Kingsguard are encouraged to do that. They do die for their king, whereas sellsword captains don't expect their subordinates to die for them. But even the White Book is younger than these records of the second sons. And of course, interestingly, this gives us a nice comparison. Jaime's deeds are in the White Book. And Tyrion's are now going to be in the Second Sons book. So isn't that just a neat way to sort of describe the type of person that those two have come out to be in the way the world views them? I mean, he really is a second son, too, Tyrion is. And still disinherited, even though his brother joined the Kingsguard and should have put him in line to inherit. So the way Joe writes it, Jaime's the golden boy, the hero who fits all the traditional requirements of being the main man, the prototype of what you find in the stories. Tyrion represents all the other end of the scale in terms of beautiful golden boys. So he's in this other book, and that's how it's always seemed to Tyrion. Tyrion really feels like this has been his lot in life all along. There's a certain rueful sense of belonging here. Like I said, rueful, semi-sarcastic. It's a little unfair, too. If you were to actually stack up Tyrion's deeds in battle, maybe they wouldn't look quite as cool as Jaime's, but they're not shameful, right? His deeds on the Blackwater, like he led men across the bridge of boats, he stopped one of the gates from being broken in. If this were the U.S. military, Tyrion would have been decorated several times for the Blackwater, including a Purple Heart for his injury, but also probably like a Bronze Star or something for bravery. I'm not exactly sure how those all work, but he absolutely stood out as a commander in that battle, ahead and during, and then after for his injuries. So, fair play, Tyrion has done some brave deeds. Now, some of these other names that are mentioned, real briefly, Aerion, Brightflame is mentioned there. Of course, we actually see him in the first Dunk and Egg story. He's kind of interesting. There's all sorts of theories about him and if he had other kids while he was in exile and what else he did with that time in exile. His descendants
did he even learn any hobbies? He was there for a while.
He learned how to brew wildfire. He didn't learn to not drink it, though. Of course, Bittersteel, we talked about him in the intro as well. We have a whole episode on him, plus lots of episodes that include him. Blackfire Rebellion series covers him very thoroughly, so we won't get too deep into him here. Roderick Stark, though, I mentioned him in the intro. We don't have an episode on him, though. Interestingly, we do have some talk on his family in, of all places, an episode on House Royce. You might be like, well, why House Royce? Because, well, in the intro, I said Roderick Stark was the seventh of 7 children. Their father was Baron Stark, and their mother was Laura Royce. So there you go, Royce. She was the mother of all 7 of those kids. And like I said, that's Ned's grandfather, Roderick Stark. It's a great-grandfather. It's also his great-great-uncle, because like Tywin and Joanna, Ned's father married his first cousin. So, yeah, that's what happened. And like I also said in the intro, Roderick's brothers, at least 2 of them, were at the Battle of Long Lake, which is going to come up in Jon's chapter. And we have lots of wonder about that generation, because it's the same generation that supposedly is going to be on display for the book She-Wolves of Winterfell, which is a working title. And it should be the 5th Dunk and Egg novel. And the setting is that a lot of Lord Stark have died recently, and this aforementioned Baron is currently dying of a wound suffered at the hands of Dagon Greyjoy's Iron Men. Another name that has come up an awful lot during Valar Rereadis, especially the latter 2 books. And, well, because so many Lord Stark had died in a short period of time, Baron was followed in the grave by his eldest son, Donor Stark, which allowed Willem to inherit. And the idea is that it's called the She-Wolves of Winterfell because there were so many former Lady Stark still roaming the halls, and there was a little bit of a power struggle, and there wasn't an adult man either. So there wasn't an obvious leader figure, at least traditional obvious leader figure. So presumably we're going to find out about these figures of these strong women figures, these Lady Starks, as well as perhaps see young Nan. So that's a story to look forward to. And, well, that's enough segue away from that. Let's come back to the Second Sons and Tyrion here. Jorah Mormont, of course, now is another member of the Second Sons. He's also not a second son, literally, but he did lose his inheritance. So he kind of fits in that sense. Other Second Sons include Harwin Hardhand. He wasn't mentioned here in this chapter, but he was a second son. And that's the guy that founded the dynasty that took over that built Harrenhal. It was Harwin's grandson was Harren the Black, and Harwin Hardhand himself is the one that forged the kingdom of Isle and Rivers from just the kingdom of the Isles. So he's the conqueror of the Riverlands. So that's a pretty big deal. His life story is clearly an homage to Harold Hardrada's story. Harold Hardrada, the famous Viking king who died in 1066 at Stamford Bridge, and Hardrada means hard ruler and hard hand. Well, there you go. We'll have to do an episode on Harwin Hardhand and his kin someday. The Tattered Prince was also in the Second Sons. That's not mentioned here, which seems like that would be an interesting little anecdote, but he was in it for about a year. And of course, Oberyn Martell was in it. Funny story. We would like to know about that stint, but we don't know anything about it. We can guess that maybe it was during Robert's Rebellion, which would explain Oberyn's absence. He was perhaps with the Second Sons or some other sellsword company and was not even aware of the war going on back in Westeros, or was perhaps unable to get out of his contract. I figure he could have gotten out of his contract being a prince. He could have paid his way out. But in any case, that might be the explanation for why he wasn't around. The armor of the Second Sons, this guy, Hammer, he's not very good. He's a heavy drinker. He's not super reliable, apparently. I don't know that Tyrion's really going to stay in the Second Sons really long, but when he mentions his anecdote of Casterly Rock and getting the drains to work really well, and the fact that that's come up before, it's probably a clue as to how they'll get into Casterly Rock, but it also is an indication of the type of person Tyrion is, that he's an effective administrator. When he's in charge, things run a little more smoothly, especially compared to some of these other people. So if Tyrion's administrative skills might actually be of value to the Second Sons, maybe this is the kind of thing that he straightens out. He's good at delegating tasks. He's had experience with leadership. That is one benefit. There's plenty of benefits to being so highborn, and one of them is learning leadership skills. Hammer mocks Tyrion for claiming he's killed 9 men with a crossbow. We know Tyrion's lying. He's killed 1 man with a crossbow. Tyrion thinks to himself that his father is worth 9 people. Fair. It's fair. Maybe worth more than 9 people, really. Though, to be fair, Tyrion probably has killed about 9 people by hand, not just only 1 with the crossbow. Maybe not quite 9, but he killed several people at the Blackwater and a 1 or 2 at the Green Fork, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, he's a blooded warrior. Speaking of, there's this interesting moment where he meets this guy Kem, right? Kem from King's Landing, who is perhaps a second son, literally, because his brother died on the Bridge of Ships. It's not stated whether Kem was the older one or not, but it doesn't matter. Just an idle thought there. Kem suggests he had a boy he was fond of back at King's Landing. Slight suggestion that he's gay. He's from Flea Bottom, most certainly. And it's interesting that we get to see the view of people like Tywin, which is a point that comes up through commoners who lived through some of Tywin's administration. And this is a perfect example of that. Because not only does he remember the sack, or at least has memories of it happening, maybe he didn't live through it, but he remembers being at the Blackwater with Tywin's army coming to smash them from behind, because he fought on Stannis' side. So Joe notes that this is clearly a resourceful young man to survive all that. Probably a little bit of luck as well. But arguably, Joe makes the point here that this is a broken man. He's not quite as broken as some others. He's got this company of brothers to keep him afloat, but he's not a happy person. His life was taken from him, and this is just making the most of it. It's not. There's not a lot of hope in a life like this. We wonder why George is including this anecdote. What's the point of this Kem character? Well, it's helping us bring Tyrion back home in his mind, going back to King's Landing, thinking about Tywin, because the conversation turns to Tyrion's father, of course. And of course, it could be, knowing Tyrion, getting in good with these folk. He might have plans to hire the Second Sons to make them his men in some way. And if he's going to do that, may as well try to win a little loyalty. He's walking around talking to the men, right? We've seen this kind of thing before. You get to know your soldiers, and they may not realize that's what he's doing, but we should consider that it is on our end. He has this moment where he thinks of some of his thoughts kind of come around, I suppose you could say. The quote is, "Jaime," thought Tyrion, "Shay, Tysha, my wife. I miss my wife, the wife I hardly knew." So he's admitting what he misses. That's important because before he was mad at Jaime. He still didn't want to think about Jaime, and it was slowly, his anger was slowly melting away. And now it appears, it might still be there in some form or fashion, but it's been replaced by his former strong feelings, positive feelings towards Jaime. Of course, now they're mixed in with this wistfulness that their relationship is not what it was, that it's splintered and shattered, and then he applies that to all these other people. And this is part of why we think of Kem being a bit of a broken man, is that it segues into Tyrion thinking of all his losses and how familiar that seems to what we just heard, but from a much different type of person, a person with a much different life. And, well, it may be just what he's been through. It may be that since he's been a slave, he's got new perspective on things. The prospect of death, again, going into battle, all these brushes with disease. Like, Tyrion's one of the few, and probably the only named character, at least off the top of my head, who had to deal with the threat of grayscale and the Pale Mare. So, he's had some stresses, let's say. I mean, of course, so have pretty much everyone around him. But, yeah. So, and again, here, reminder, caveat, that Tyrion regaining his identity isn't 100% good, right? There's old Tyrion had some pretty serious flaws. A lot of them are echoes of his upbringing when he tries to act like his father. His thoughts on slavery and choosing to be a slave versus dying. That's another thing that I have kind of mixed feelings on. First of all, he includes himself on this. He's not so arrogant and detached that he doesn't realize how these lines of thinking apply to him. So that's pretty good. Self-awareness is something I think we should give some credit for. He also notices what's going on with Jorah and sees that Jorah is also kind of coming out of it. He's no longer staring off into the distance. He's actually got some energy, but more on him in a sec. The choice to be a slave is something that Tyrion weighs in. And I don't know that choice is really the right word here. The mental contortions you have to do to kill off your pride in order to survive in such an environment. Not everyone would see that as a choice. Choosing to die, choosing to kill yourself, to go through horrible suffering in order to not prolong milder but much more stretched out suffering. Choice maybe isn't the right word for that. Technically, you could say it is, and that's where Tyrion is. Maybe I shouldn't argue too much or quibble too much with that word choice, word choice of choice, because it doesn't have to be the context that I'm assuming. So we should give it some leeway. But it is interesting that George tries to go there and show just how insidious slavery is to your state of mind and what you have to change within yourself in order to survive it. But regardless, however you view Tyrion's thoughts, I think we can say for a pretty strong certainty that Daenerys would not be thinking like this. She would not be thinking along these lines. She would not be thinking about slaves having a choice. Her thoughts would tend to be a lot more compassionate along those lines. So it'll be really interesting to see how, when Tyrion and Dany come together, assuming that happens, how these ideas come out and how they debate them and the way these philosophies emerge. Penny, too. I mean, it's hard to put yourself in her place. She's had so much loss and has no place in the world, sort of like Kem, in a sense. Just doesn't know what to do with herself and doesn't know where she would be safe. And so Kem is not in denial about his life. That's one difference, is that he's had time to adjust to these circumstances, where Penny is just fresh into it. She's probably much younger than him. And Tyrion needs to convince her that she is in real danger and to wear armor and to just hold on for a while. Because his goal is for them to switch sides. And though he doesn't say this to her here, he has said it to her before, that Daenerys will probably be good to them. Certainly good to Penny. And I think that's true. I mean, it's hard I couldn't come up with an argument otherwise. Maybe Dany changes, but the Dany we know now would absolutely be compassionate towards Penny. 100%. Like, it seems like a foregone conclusion. So, and Tyrion did classify Dany as a, quote, rescuer. And so, I mean, of course, that's not all Dany is, but that part is accurate. So, anyway, speaking of someone whose experience with slavery is relevant, and in this case is more karmic, and that's by the way, an important point. Penny's been through slavery, Jorah's been through slavery, and both sides of it. Dany as well, Tyrion as well, Makoro as well. Like, so many of these characters that are in Dany's court will themselves be ex-slaves, or at least have endured something like slavery. So many of her officers are freedmen. You got Unsullied. Yeah, so that's kind of an interesting thing. They have that experience, and that's something that's a binding agent, something that they can all connect over. So yeah, Jorah just also really coming around. He's driven. Like Tyrion, it's not a great thing entirely that he's back to the old Jorah, but without making too many assumptions, Jorah's probably a little different now too. He's probably learned a few things. Maybe I'm not going to hold out hope for him having learned a lot, but at least he's experienced the thing he's inflicted on other people and knows what he's done. And I wonder if, having lived through that, Dany will see him differently now and will be willing to forgive him, given that he's been through so much. He's like, okay, you've suffered. Maybe that's enough. But who knows? Maybe Dany will still be like, no, get the hell out of here, man. We'll see. So this chapter doesn't just call back a lot of fun and relevant history from a few generations ago. It brings back some of Tyrion's early history. And by that, I mean a Game of Thrones. Think back to Tyrion signing notes to Mord. He signed a letter to be like, I'll give you gold and you give me get me this message to Lysa so I can state my case. And Mord, he was one of those that was held a reverence for writing, and Tyrion was kind of banking on that. It's quite possibly that kind of reverence is here in a lesser form. I mean, these guys aren't like Mord, but they are certainly enamored of the idea of this paper promising them gold, even though the likelihood of it may not be as great as it seems. Also, the first chapter in this book, right? There's that whole concept of what him and Illyrio discuss regarding contracts. Like, some contracts are written in ink and some in blood. And the blood contracts are more binding, even though they're not written or recorded. They're the ones that are held in the hearts of those that desire to make good on those promises, whether it's revenge, whether it's claiming a crown they believe is theirs, whether it's reclaiming their family's lands. Hey, Second Sons, Golden Company, Casterly Rock for Tyrion. They're all on this same track right now. It fits out pretty well. And yeah, that's going to be really cool. I think this is neat how well Tyrion actually fits into this company, even as he seems to not fit in so many other ways. Because he's not, a warrior. He's not, doesn't have the stature of a sellsword, etc. So, yeah, very cool. I like that. Not a lot happens in this chapter. It's fair to say, maybe, like arguably this chapter could have been split in half, and you could have put the front half of it in Tyrion's last chapter and the second half in his first Winds of Winter chapter. Nevertheless, there's a lot for us to talk about because the historical anecdotes are potent, and that's something we love to get into. So the rabbit holes for our History of Westeros perspective are excellent, but I think some people would rate this chapter a little lower than others, but that's a matter of opinion. Carrie McIntyre says, just got married. Let's hear a shout out. Hey, Valentine's Day just got married. Perfect, my friend. That's excellent. Shout out to you and your new spouse. Best of love and life and luck to you all. There's a strange quote by Tyrion in this one that says, we all have our drooling cousins. My father put the worst of them down in the cells at Casterly Rock. Like, wait, really? Is that just sarcasm, or did Tywin Lannister actually put family members in cells at Casterly Rock because he was embarrassed by them?
It's like in the show.
The Orson?
Yeah.
That, exactly.
It's awful.
With the Beatles? Yeah, like, what was that all about? So I'm like, I feel like this is an exaggeration, but maybe it's not. And if it's true, then good Lord, the list of Tywin Lannister's hypocrisies is something we covered thoroughly. And if this one would be included, it would be near the top. Because, man, this guy's all about family, and he does this. I don't know. It feels exaggerated because it's so outlandish and outstanding that it may have come up before. But still, file that one away. Stefan B. Points out that this is also similar to the Brotherhood Without Banners promissory notes that were given to like Sandor, and they're like, yeah, we'll give you back your tournament winnings. Here's your paper. There is probably more intent here, but still, Tyrion is definitely thinking in the back of his mind that he may never pay these either. So there's definitely that sense of this might just be paper. Rolling Knight, very good catch. Just as Kem gives us a look from afar at what Tywin looked like to him, a commoner from Flea Bottom, we have the same thing happen in Dunk and Egg. That Dunk relates it the first time he saw Bloodraven from afar. It describes his gear and with his men in their raven's teeth regalia, whatever that looked like. A similar description to Tywin with his red lions and their helms and their red cloaks and all that. So that's pretty cool, yeah. And both views were from Flea Bottom. The descriptions were, that's where the observation was made from. Good catch. Also, Jorah has nipples on his breastplate. They're like pierced nipples. They're like actual rings. Like, it's pretty funny.
Jorah's useless.
Yeah. Tree Girl, very good meta comment here when she notes that at one point there's the quote, he had found a rhythm now when he's signing the contracts, like he's getting into a pattern, like he's getting it going. George R. Martin himself absolutely has lived through that so many times. Book signings. George does the book signings, so he's done this a lot. Absolutely. I'm sure he was thinking of that. That's a great catch by Tree Girl. Shay and I have been to many signings of George R. Martin, and he manages to, he and his team keep them smooth. This guy is experienced and skilled. He's also generous with his time. Our first ever signing, the line was really long, and it looked like we may not get there. One of his assistants just comes out and goes, please stay in line. George will get all of you signed and squared away. If you're in line now, don't worry about the time. So
it was extra nice because it was a hot day and people were standing outside, queuing outside in cosplay. It was a miserable day, and I think it was our first signing, right?
Yes.
And we were like very stressed out because we weren't at the beginning of the line.
It was like, is this what signings are like?
Yes, that's what it's like. No, that was the craziest George signing I've ever been to. Was that first one?
And since then, we've even had a couple where we were able to go through the line twice because he lets you do that if the lines are not super long.
Yeah, WorldCon's a good one for that because there's a lot of other authors there.
So in a world where we often hear things that we don't like about the creator or guys and gals that make the works that we love, it's nice to hear George is, not perfect, but a good person, generally speaking. It's nice to hear things like that, and so we want to relay them to you. If you're familiar with Theon 1, The Winds of Winter, you might recall a nice parallel moment to this chapter when Stannis slashes his thumb and signs in blood since the ink has frozen. In this chapter, the ink isn't frozen. That would be weird. But Tyrion also adds real blood to it. So there's the slashing of the thumb and blood as ink and signing in blood and all that. So that's a nice little theme, I suppose, or at least a pattern. Curtis Frank says, I would not call it hypocrisy. Tywin is about reputation and legacy, not family per se. Family is just a tool to those other things for him. Gross, nonetheless, fitting for Tywin. Okay, yeah, I think Tywin presents himself as caring about family, and that you could say is hypocritical. But I guess you could say, I wouldn't disagree with you that you're right, that he is consistently about reputation and legacy. He will lie about what things lead to that. So, yeah, okay, I can see that. Carl Carsnark says, there are old sailors, there are bold sailors, there are not old, bold sailors. Oh, that's a proverb, huh? Maybe that's where George got that. That's very cool. Guilty Undertaker says, responds to Carl Carsnark. That name is hard to say. I had a rock climber telling me the same thing about climbers. Yeah.
Aziz likes to climb rock.
I'm a rock climber. I don't do a lot of actual outdoor climbing. My rock climbing is almost entirely in gyms. But it's true. There are climbers who don't climb with ropes, and it's inevitable that one day you only have to mess up once, and that's it. Yeah. Onward. The Kingbreaker. The Coup That Killed Khrazz, aka The Eyes of Ashara Dayne. A chapter that reminds me a bit of Cersei chapters in that it just contains so much of interest to discuss. It's incredible. Like Cersei, there's a lot going on around Barristan that he doesn't perceive, he's not fully aware of. And also like Cersei, Barristan is surrounded by people trying to deceive him, even his allies in some cases. Cersei expects obedience even when it might be unreasonable, and perhaps we could say that about Barristan, but substitute honor for obedience, right? He's honorable even when it's unreasonable to be honorable, something that ties him to Ned Stark thematically. Skahaz, though we don't trust him, is probably along these lines in a different way. He's probably one of those characters that's an ally, but also trying to deceive him, but maybe not an ally, depending on how things turn out. Depending on how their goals end up lining up, which right now is up in the air. Barristan's memories, as I keep saying almost every episode that he's in, are a great source of hope for us. His memories are just so many things he could reveal. And though his depth of knowledge spans a time far longer than Cersei's entire life, there's a lot of overlap in the characters they think of. Rhaegar, whom she thought she would marry, obviously Barristan thinks about him. Aerys, who denied her the marriage to Rhaegar, who obviously Barristan thinks about Aerys quite a bit. Tywin, who promised that marriage to his daughter, and who, of course, Barristan has lots of thoughts on Tywin because of Duskendale and other things. Jaime got his white cloak at the tourney of Harrenhal, which is a huge feature of this chapter as well. And of course, Cersei's arc is all wrapped up in Jaime's stuff, and vice versa. In some ways, it seems incongruous to compare Cersei and Barristan in the first place, but the longer we spend comparing them, the more the exercise reveals. Women, as we have been taught rather brutally by the faith, aren't supposed to have sex for pleasure. They're supposed to be primarily about duty to their husband and children, yet also sort of not lining up, like conflicting with that is women being valued for their beauty. Yet these contradictions exist, clearly. Men are likewise valued for their ability to kill or rule, mostly. Barristan's not a ruler, but he is an extreme skilled guy at killing. And in line with Cersei's extreme beauty, they're both somewhat trapped by these extremes in society. They're somewhat defined by them. Just like the sex stuff, Barristan, as a Knight of the Kingsguard, is not allowed to have sex at all, let alone for pleasure. You know, women are Cersei's allowed to have sex to have kids, so that's it. Similar near celibacy type situation, and it's all about duty. They're basically just forced into these roles of duty, and it's an extreme sense of that because their duties are all consuming. Barristan's Cersei's beauty was turned against her by her walk. Though no, it's a much milder version, and we're not exactly sure where all the deceptions are around Barristan. His honorable sword has been corrupted by the Game of Thrones. He recognizes this, even if he doesn't recognize the specifics. He does say that the worst Kingsguard are those who play the Game of Thrones, and now he's doing it. Of course, there's also huge differences between him and Cersei. Don't get me wrong. Huge differences. Having a lot in common doesn't mean you're similar. People are more complicated than that. Human beings have thousands of facets, so just lining up 10 or 20, even if they line up really well, that still leaves you with 990 that aren't the same. So don't get me wrong here. Skahaz, though, if we were to switch places, imagine Skahaz trying to convince Cersei to kill the hostages. For example, that would be easy. She'd be like, sure, okay. Stoking her fear and paranoia would be a lot easier. Now, Barristan, though, it's also an unusual place for a man to find himself. He's got an established career. He's been doing this similar thing all his life, and all of a sudden, he's part of a coup. That's not nearly the only thing about this that's new to him, though. They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but you can teach a bold dog new tricks? Probably not. What about an old, bold dog? No, never mind. But I don't bring up dog randomly. It's the password given to Quentyn. The wrong password. This chapter happens parallel to the Quentyn chapter. And George doesn't do a lot of parallel chaptering. Usually it's partly overlapping. This is maybe the only time they fully overlap right next to each other in the same location. Certainly, certain battle chapters might have that too, though, or battle scenes. In this case of the wrong password is a perfect micro example of why this chapter is placed before Quentyn's. When we hear the news that the dragons are loose, there's no hint that someone is, say, writing one of them, so even a first-time reader knows when starting the next chapter that it's not going to work. The dragons got loose because they failed. Clearly, they didn't capture them because they're flapping around. And that's how the chapter ends. Here's how it begins.
A pale shadow and a dark. The two conspirators came together in the quiet of the armory on the Great Pyramid's second level, amongst racks of spears, sheaves of quarrels, and walls hung with trophies from forgotten battles.
The intro was pretty long this time, but there's another theme that I could have mentioned. Maybe not a theme, just a pattern. This is just a pattern, I guess. Maybe you can call it a theme, whatever. 3 of these 4 chapters have scenes in armories. Wait, no, I did mention that at the beginning. Anyway, well, here we are. We're with one of these armory scenes. So Nina writes, the use of pale shadow to denote Barristan works nicely as a contrast to the dark shadow of Khrazz. They're both committed to their goals, deposing Hisdar for his alleged attempt to poison Dany, but of course, he probably didn't do that. Barristan's under the impression of that. He believes that, but he's probably been misled. He's also not nearly as bought into this plan. Like, Khrazz is all about all of this. He is eager. To him, it's like a long time coming, like a big milestone in Giscari history. Like, today is a new day. Like, man, he's ready for this. Barristan is a lot more wary. Not shy, certainly not scared. That doesn't describe him well at all. But uncertain if he's making the right decisions. And that, yeah, we're with you, Barristan, because we're not entirely sure what's going on either. We just have a sense of it. We have intuitions. We have peculiarities. We have niggling thoughts, things like that, not certainties. One thing, for example, is the death of the dragons. That's not in doubt that the Yunkai want that. They announced it in front of court. They made it a demand. Now, interestingly, Khrazz uses this as leverage. He says, look, and he might be right to, because the threat is real. He says, look, Barristan, they're going to try to kill the dragons. We got to stop them. We got to act now. There's lots of reasons that we can't wait. The Volantene fleet is coming. Don't forget about that. Yunkai wants to sack the city before they get here. There's so many things happening, and they're on a timeline, and that timeline is short. So Barristan has to weigh how much Khrazz is actually on his side and how much he's on Dany's side and all these other things, and he's not great at making those judgments. But it does, and Khrazz is really, really good in making the half-truths seem like full truths and spinning motivations where they don't exist because they fit. They aren't real, but they fit. They make sense. They could work. Like blaming Hisdar as the poisoner, if you were able to put this evidence together and present it, you could make a decent case. I think a lot of you are like me, that you don't agree with that case, but before you got deep into the weeds of trying to figure it out, it might have seemed possible. Maybe not the most rational thing for him to do, but we don't know all Hisdar's goals. We don't know all his plans and everything behind the scenes. Like, who knows what the Harpy wants? Who knows what these other Myronese nobles want, etc. Now, where was I? So, honor is well and good. But we're talking about victory. And we're also talking about saving lives. So, it's another really interesting balance. Like, Barristan is trying to be honorable, and it puts us in mind of Ned Stark trying to force honor into a situation that maybe it doesn't belong. Maybe honor is actually hurting their cause, but you still kind of respect it. I don't know. I don't want to speak for other people, but it's very interesting to try to balance all that and say, hey, Barristan's a good person, but maybe this isn't the time for that. I don't know. George is really throwing conundrums at us here. Here's an important part of the conversation between that it comes down to Barristan holds his ground. He's like, no, we're doing it my way. You agreed it. And the line is, we discussed this. You agreed it would be my way.
I agreed, the shaved pate grumbled, but that was before Grolio, the head. The slavers have no honor.
We do,
said Sir Barristan.
Well, he does. I don't know if Khrazz really does, but he's trying to make Khrazz act like he does. So this is where things really come to a head, too. Though, yeah, it's a good point that, yeah, they killed a hostage, so that means we have the right to take action. But it's not just the Yunkish hostages. He wants to kill the child hostages, and Barristan is shocked by that for good reason. Not only has he gotten to know the hostage personally and their children, That's reason enough not to kill them, but he knows Dany, and Dany just would not tolerate that, even under extreme situations. So he's not going to go. He's really trying to do what he thinks Dany would do, right down to bad things like save Daario. Even though he knows Dario's bad for her, or at least he thinks Dario's bad for her, he still intends to save Daario because that's what Dany would do. He's not inserting his own wishes in here hardly at all, which is kind of interesting. And the thinking of dead children takes him back, way back to right after Robert's Rebellion for a very meaningful quote.
If I had seen him smile over the red ruins of Rhaegar's children, no army on this earth could have stopped me from killing him. I will not suffer the murder of children. Accept that, or I'll have no part of this.
Yeah, that's powerful, right? Barristan is usually pretty mild. Even when he's fighting, he's calm and collected. But this is about the only time we see him get angry or, have a thought this enraged. And it's over kids he knew. He knew Rhaegar's children. He was a Kingsguard to them. So he probably had an attachment like he has to these hostages, at least a somewhat similar one. But of course, as we know, what Khrazz says he's going to do and what actually happens, who knows? There's a lot of worry amongst the fandom. Nina and Joe, myself, all of us are like, what is Khrazz going to do? To him, this is about survival. Honor doesn't matter. It's, hundreds or thousands of years of these houses having these rivalries, and he knows it's live, kill or be killed. Barristan doesn't really see it that way. I'm not saying who's right and who's wrong. Just Khrazz is doing what he's doing, and that may very well involve killing child hostages. Plus, the other hostages may get killed, but less important about them, I suppose. Khrazz may actually want Daario dead because of his influence over Daenerys, and he may want fewer people influencing Daenerys, but I'm less certain about that. But it makes sense that pretty much no one wants Daario around Dany, even Dany to some extent. Similar thinking, though, in preferring Tommen to Joffrey, right? We have, just like Aerys at Duskendale, which is something that obviously is in Barristan's thoughts, Tywin pushed the issue in a way that made it seem like he was just not going to negotiate with terrorists. But really, his actions were going to lead to the death of the king. Because they're like, well, if you storm the walls, we kill the king. And he's like, well, we can't. We're not negotiating with terrorists. We storm the walls. That's what we do. And so Tywin's kind of like sloughing off his responsibility there, saying like, oh, it's not my fault. They killed him, right? Similar here. The thinking there was that if you get rid of Aerys, you have Rhaegar, who's a much better king, someone that's much easier to handle. Likewise, we saw that thinking with Olenna preferring Tommen to Joffrey, and the Tyrells in general preferring to rule through Tommen rather than have to deal with the erratic Joffrey, who reminds people of Aerys, especially someone like Olenna, who was alive for that. Probably Barristan too. So we have a confrontation after they agree on their plan, and Barristan goes to confront Hisdar. Quote,
Sorry, I have a confrontation of my own going on with
Cats.
2 cats. Okay. Hisdar looked confused.
why have you come?
To ask a question. Magnificence, are you the harpy?
Hisdar drops his cup. He's suddenly lost for words. And our writers seem to agree that this is not an act, that he's legitimately surprised by the question. It does kind of make him look guilty. And so that's part of why it's not an act, because why would he act guilty? If he's going to act innocent. So, So then there's the accusation of the locust on top of that, which he has a different reaction to. This is more of a, what are you talking about? It was probably the Dornish, or I don't know. Resnack said the Dornish are all poisoners. He doesn't seem very concerned about it. If he was, this is something we've sort of alluded to before, but if he was the poisoner, he would have a cover story, and he would have already come up with this explanation for who it probably was. He wouldn't be fumbling for words to blame someone. He would have already thought about this. So I think that's pretty telling. Now, Barristan is seeing things that he wanted to see. And that's not good because he's seeing the things that Hizdar, or rather that Ska has told him he would see, the things that he told him to be wary of, the evidence that isn't really evidence that he's looking for. Things like, oh, he was trying to kill the dragon. Oh, he's got another girl in his bed. Oh, he's calling, he's not upholding Dany's slavery laws that aggressively. Things like that. These are just, I don't know, these are signs that he's just a jerk. These are kind of an ass. These aren't signs of turning on her, right? She's still important for him to hold on to power. We saw what happened. As soon as she's gone, Hizdar has positioned himself as the king, but he's gradually losing it. His power is falling away. It's not going well for him. So it's somewhat hard to argue that he wanted this. He also just listens to Reznak so much. He says, Reznak says this, Reznak says that. This is not a guy thinking for himself, right? He's not saying Reznak. He's not putting blame on Reznak. He's just saying, this is where I get my information, which is, it just shows how unvigilant he is. He's just, go find this out for me and tell me what it is, which means that, kind of like Cersei, he's subject to being lied to by his subordinates. And that's, in a situation like this, people are lying to Hizdar. And think about what all of Barristan's thoughts about being a vigilant protector and how it builds up to this scene, all the contempt he showed for the pit fighters, and how they're like, yeah, these guys, they're pit fighters. They're not Kingsguard. They're not guards. It's so much harder. Like, to prove his point, Barristan has his sword drawn, exchanging heavy words with the king, like almost arguing. He's got his sword out, like I said. And Khrazz is just asleep in the next room, just like out, sacked out. Like, what kind of bodyguard are you? If Barristan had just come in, drawn a sword, he could have killed Hizdar. If that had been his aim, he could have killed Hizdar before Khrazz's eyes is even opened. And then he could have killed Khrazz before Khrazz got out of bed, probably. So Barristan's honor comes first, though. And he wasn't coming for an ambush or a quick strike. He's like, I'll give you a chance to put your sword down first. Now, this is honorable, but it's also a bit of a luxury because Barristan probably wouldn't be doing these kind of things if he wasn't so good at fighting. If the fear of losing was in him even a little, he might not give away some of these advantages. But he has such utter confidence in his ability to win, and it's not cockiness, it's not overconfidence, it's not even pride. Well, maybe it's a little bit of pride, but this is where we're reminded of Areo Hotah's POV. He has this level of confidence against Kingsguard. Like, Hotah had that level, has the same sort of, I'll win against a Kingsguard. And we just got through talking about how Kingsguard are on another level than these pit fighters. So Barristan's contempt is not without a lot of rationality. And then when we see the fight happen, it's like, okay, Barristan clearly outmatches this guy. But it's not speed, it's not strength. It's strategy and brains and experience, and the lack of such on the opposite side. Khrazz has killed many people, but 100% of them were in the pit. They've all been the same type of situation. And this also sends us back to Game of Thrones, just like some of the other scenes in the end of this book. It's pretty amazing how many awesome parallels we have. Jorah fights Kotho. Kotho, longsword versus Arak. The way Jorah wins that fight it's described similarly. His Arak coming from 3 directions at once. That's pretty much exactly what happens here, the way Barristan thinks about it. But Jorah is also fully armored except his helmet. And, well, Jorah's no Barristan, and maybe Kotho is better than Khrazz, because Jorah lost his ear, and instead of Khrazz's Arak getting caught on a wall hanging, Kotho's Arak gets caught in Jorah's hip. So still, same difference, though. That the little momentary delay was all the knight needed to kill the non-knight. And this is, though it's hard not to picture it, I got to remind you all here, it's important to be reminded that the TV show Araks don't look like the book Araks. They're different. The TV show ones are a lot more curved. It's more like a half moon. A Song of Ice and Fire Araks are more like curved, like almost like a scimitar.
That is a good reminder, because I do super picture the shows. I don't think any of the, they have all the Valyrian steel and all the sword versions, you know? I don't think they have any of those out, do they?
They only sell the TV show versions, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they have it, but I wonder if they have a Valyrian Steel era act like Hago Corp Killer
Yeah.
one. That'd be pretty cool.
Hmm.
But which does feature in the next chapter. But yeah, it's different because that's important to think about, because if you picture a slashing weapon like a cleaver, imagine trying to chop through armor. Like, of course it doesn't work. No wonder Khrazz isn't getting anywhere. Barristan's longsword is what Khrazz needs, because a longsword you can actually pierce. With a curved tip, you can't pierce, right? You don't have to know weapons to understand that concept. So honestly, if their weapons had been reversed, it would have been a better fight. But we weren't looking for a good fight. We wanted Barristan to win. So you don't have to know weapons at all to grasp that concept of why chopping at steel isn't going to get you anywhere. Incidentally, that's why maces and axes are popular weapons amongst knights, because you can bend and shatter bones without actually penetrating the steel. You just cave it in. Or hammers, like Robert Baratheon, right? Similar line of thinking. And these are precisely the kinds of lessons Barristan teaches his young squires, like Tumco Low and the Red Lamb, about why certain weapons are useful and which opponents to use them against. No one ever taught Khrazz these things, but he did learn plenty of confidence along the way, as this quote indicates right here.
Khrazz laughed. Old man, I will eat your heart. The two men were of a height, but Khrazz was 2 stone heavier and 40 years younger, with pale skin, dead eyes, and a crest of bristly red-black hair that ran from his brow to the base of his neck.
Then come,
said Barristan the Bold. Khrazz came. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, everybody. Khrazz came. For the first time all day, Selmy felt certain. God, I just keep looking at his ears and it's hard. Okay. For the first time all day, Selmy felt certain. Please read this.
For the first time all day, Selmy felt certain. This is what I was made for, he thought. The dance, the sweet steel song, a sword in my hand and a foe before me. It's funny that Ashara couldn't make it through that, because this is a quote that several of you cited as one of the most chilling, bomb moments of the whole book.
Crying from laughter.
So we all have different reactions to these moments, clearly. But it is a really awesome moment. George waits till this moment to have him refer to himself as Barristan the Bold. It's like the name is thrown around, but he's never Barristan the Bold. It's always other people calling him that, or just the name popping up here and there. But he becomes the legend in this moment, and it's so cool. It sends us back to other places. Even though Quentin is currently several levels down, Dancing with Dragons, more reminded of poor Waymar Royce. Again, going right back, not just to the first book, but the first chapter. Like Khrazz, poor Waymar had no chance to beat that nameless other in the prologue, but he lost bravely and said, "Dance with me then," as he met his fate. And in this one, Selmy thinks the dance, the sweet steel song. Note that Selmy doesn't win by being faster or stronger. In fact, he notes that Khrazz has him beat there. Khrazz is faster and stronger. And of course, that's not a surprise, given Khrazz is 40 years younger. 40? That's so much younger for a fight, right? And I imagine that other who beat Royce felt similarly confident. After all, just as Khrazz has no idea how to fight an armored knight, Royce had no idea how to fight an other. Also, the other who slew Waymar was probably a lot more than 40 years older than him, as well as faster and stronger. So really, that other had all the advantages. And in both cases, their opponent knew that, right? The other knew Royce had no idea how to fight him. His strange white armor and odd sword were alien to the young knight. Not much different for Khrazz, except for the, lack of supernatural terror and freezing cold. It was regular terror and, warmth. But also think of Victarion's last chapter, the certainty of doing what you're best at. Or think of Victarion in the Reaver chapter when he just confidently lets men stab him, trusting his armor to block the blows. And then one by one, he just kills them while they're stabbing him. you have to be really confident in your armor to do that, right? But Barristan and Victarion just let people hit them because they know like this, they can't get through that steel. And they're also both used to dominating. They're both just their whole life. They've been like, yeah, I've always been good at this. They're not used to not being good at it. Khrazz too, though. That's part of why Khrazz just was so helpless and didn't know what to do. He's like, wow, I've never been challenged like this before. Whoops. And more on the armor bit, too. There's just so much that we can wrap up in different cultural contexts here. Victarion, again, respected Sir Talbot Serry, calling him almost Ironborn for wearing armor at sea, right? Because that's what brave men do. And Barristan, similarly, gives him a designation from his culture, an honorific that's unique to where he comes from. He calls Khrazz Sir, which Khrazz would be like, what does that mean? But it is a moment of respect, just like it was for Victarion. He's like, that dude was pretty brave. He's saying, well, you're brave, so you at least deserve some respect. But again, it's strategy. Barristan's like, all I got to do is block the ones coming from my head, let the rest go. Eventually, this guy's going to make a mistake. His sword is too long for these close quarters. He's tiring himself out. You know, he's screaming. He's afraid. Scared people make mistakes. This is akin to what we expect from Stannis versus Hostine Frey, aka Sir Stupid. Stannis says, angry foes don't frighten me. Angry foes do stupid things. That's exactly what Khrazz does. Khrazz does stupid things as he gets angry. Like, you know, not concede. That's what he should have done. So just what Stannis says is a reflective of what we hear about a lot of knights and how they handle problems. Just couch your lance and charge. That's exactly what Stannis is counting on. Yeah, couch your lance, charge right into my pit trap. Lance, Arak, same difference in this context. There's also some symbolism, not just these thematic comparisons, not just these logistical similarities. For example, the corridor leading into the room here before they have their duel is made of black and red bricks. And I can't remember that specific description ever happening before, so it's very Targaryen. Nina does an amazing breakdown of the decor in Hizdar's room, which tells us a lot. First of all, there's silk carpets out of Qarth, which Qarth is openly at war with Daenerys. They never were about the negotiations. And Qarth is deep in the slave trade. You know, Qarth and Meereen and Yunkai, they're all in business together. They're all slavers, of course. I mean, they're near each other. And they have, so this is a hint that he's more for Qarth than Dany. The walls are covered with, quote, priceless tapestries depicting the glory of the old empire of Gis. Hizdar has literally hung a sign on the walls proclaiming his allegiance to the old Giscari ways. We have, here's another thing, a carpet that has or a tapestry rather, the last survivors of a defeated Valyrian army passing beneath the yoke and being chained. This is the artwork you portray? Like a beat enslaving Valyrians? Like, I mean, I get why Giscari have that, but maybe it's time to switch out the decor when you're married to a Valyrian who has dragons, you know? So, yeah, I don't know about that. So it's a pretty strong sign of where Hizdar's loyalties are, even if it doesn't necessarily indicate his actions. Because again, bottom line for Hizdar is he's soft. Like, he's found hiding behind a curtain after all this. The guy is definitely not a man who projects toughness, spine. We saw that very clearly in the throne room scene. It was a big feature of that thing. Not to mention, too, the Qartheen connection. Khrazz is Giscari. They're normally brown-skinned, but he's pale, which, no, that's not super unusual. But maybe he's part Qartheen or something. Maybe that's part of this connection. He's one of Hizdar's top guards. Qartheen are the milkmen. They're pale-skinned. So that's why I have this theory. But the best symbolism, I think, comes with the long-running comparison to Kingsguard and others. Why do we compare the Kingsguard and the others? All white, snow and ice descriptions are constant, but also it's this, they don't have minds of their own in a lot of ways. Barristan, his whole life as a Kingsguard, some people in the chat even compared it loosely to like Nazi prison guards. Maybe that's going a bit far. But the point being that they obeyed awful orders. They obeyed atrocity orders, and Barristan did too. Not nearly to the same degree. Again, do not compare this to real world stuff, especially not serious stuff like that. But the concept of people who went along with evil doesn't have to be that level to be understood. It can be, just the concept of I was just following orders, right? That can apply to a number of historical events of varying degrees. So, and this theme is really brought out by George. Again, the theme of the way the others even work. The undead are their servants, their slaves, mindless slaves. And as we've saw on the show, it's probably not quite this simple, but if you kill the other that raised the dead that other raised drop with it. So it gives this same sort of thing. All you got to do is protect the head, and the rest lives. The body is armored in ice, metaphorically in snow. And even as Barristan is putting on his armor, both those phrases come up. He thinks of his hard as ice armor and his snow white cloak with only his head exposed. Then he leaps over the coals as Khrazz tips the brazier over, making himself ice over fire. Then Khrazz dies on the carpet as the carpet smolders. That's blood and fire, right? His blood leaking out as the carpet is smoldering and smoking. It's an Azor Ahai moment. Dragons are literally awakening. Well, not literally. Dragons are awakening in their stone prison as Khrazz is stabbed in the heart, specifically in the heart. After his stomach is cut open, Barristan finishes him off with a slash, with a thrust to the heart. I don't know who the red star in this scene is, but it might be him. He's the star of the pit, and he's bleeding all over. Maybe that's a reach. But what about the smoke and salt, you say? Where's your smoke and salt, Aziz? Well, here it is.
Here and there, the carpets had begun to smolder where some of the scattered coals had fallen. He could hear poor Keza sobbing.
It's the next line. It's smoke, then salt. Back-to-back sentences. That's cool, huh? Without the dragons part, though, what you didn't know about when you read this the first time, you didn't know that as this was happening, the dragons were being let free. You found that out at the end of the chapter. So again, this reread, or any reread, has this enormous power because George didn't write that for first-time readers because they couldn't have caught it. So George put all this symbolism in, all this work to connect all these dots. That's for rereaders. That's for us. First-time readers can't catch that. Come on. Who's that smart? Who's got a memory that can record all these things and collate it all after memorizing it? Like, come on. One person in a million can do that, maybe.
Just on the subject of rereads,
Yeah.
I was thinking about books that George would reread, and he said before, he's like, I like to reread Lord of the Rings every year. So he would certainly expect that.
Yeah, it's true. It's like it fits into his like attitude on how it should go. Like,
Yeah.
why not read why would you love a book and only read it once in your life? You know, it's kind of, when you put it that way, like, yeah, well, I'm preaching to the choir, y'all. You wouldn't be here if you weren't rereaders also. I doubt many non-rereaders are hearing my voice right now. So it's also hard to know the kind of thinker Barristan was in his youth, but this is quite possibly what helped him stand out in such a competitive field. I mean, greatest knight in Westeros, that is a hotly contested title. So Barristan clearly has physical gifts, privileges like that. He's highborn, that helps. Not super highborn, but pretty highborn. But he's smart. I think that's one thing that really separates him. Like his strategy, his confidence. Like I said, he's a little bit proud, but he's not macho, right? He's not like, he doesn't exhibit a lot of these. He does some, but doesn't exhibit a lot of what we would call now toxic masculinity. He has less of that. It's all over this society, but he is above a lot of that, which is something we like about him. I mean, Barristan is a very great character. He's a decent person, but as we're about to get into, even he has a lot of regrets over things he did in his life, and fair play. I mean, yeah, like he rescued the Mad King. Maybe he shouldn't have done that. So as for how much he's been fooled by Skahaz and these other things, we'll see. But we do have a sense of how he's going to behave. That's one thing that we can definitely say, I think, is a reason to call him decent. Because he's principled. He sticks up for children. He shares a lot of Dany's values, even if he can't perfectly reach them still. And that is partly why he reminds us of Ned so much as well. He's a fish out of water who tries to protect the kids. And that is all very interesting when we pivot to long lingering thoughts regarding Rhaegar, who didn't trust him near as much as some of these others.
The memory was still bitter. Old Lord Went had announced the tourney shortly after a visit from his brother, Ser Oswell Went of the Kingsguard. With Varys whispering in his ear, King Aerys became convinced that his son was conspiring to depose him, that Went's tourney was but a ploy to give Rhaegar a pretext for meeting with as many great lords as could be brought together. Aerys had not set foot outside the Red Keep since Duskendale, yet suddenly he announced that he would accompany Prince Rhaegar to Harrenhal, and everything had gone awry from there.
Well, first of all, Varys is probably right. Trying to depose Aerys, yeah, they probably were. It's really wow, cat fights over here. It's really not unlikely, and Aerys, well, you don't have to really imagine why they wanted to get rid of Aerys. Yeah, and then everything went awry. Yes, as Barristan says. Now, we've covered the Tournament of Harrenhal before. We covered it when it was first introduced in Bran's chapters. It was the tale of the Tournament at Harrenhal, that story time episode or chapter with Bran and Mira and them. But Duskendale is part of the point here. Why didn't this thought was introduced because Rhaegar doesn't trust Barristan. Gee, why didn't Rhaegar trust Barristan? I wonder why. The dude that goes on an ultra daring rescue mission to save him? Gee, maybe that's why Rhaegar didn't let you in his inner circle, because he saw you as ultra loyal to the Mad King. I think Rhaegar has a point. So the hero of Duskendale, like, would you really bring him into your conspiracy against the man he rescued at Duskendale? I mean, Arthur Dayne was there too, but he didn't try to rescue the king. He didn't volunteer. The White Bull was Lord Commander at the time. He was almost certainly there too, but he clearly didn't go inside to try to rescue Aerys. He didn't say no to Barristan either, but he probably didn't expect Barristan to succeed. Only Barristan probably expected to succeed, and maybe even Barristan didn't expect to succeed. Again, this is stuff we cover in our Duskendale episode, but I think you can see why Barristan wasn't in Rhaegar's inner circle. Nina writes, compared to Arthur Dayne, yeah, Rhaegar trusted Arthur a lot, and there's some other reasons too, though. In a world where Rhaegar probably felt pretty alone. One person singled out by prophecy and fate could be seen as Arthur Dayne, right? As in the burden of thousands of years of history. This guy's the sword of the morning. Talk about a legacy to uphold. It's not as much pressure as being a king. It's not as much pressure as thinking you're Azor Ahai or the prince that was promised. But it's something. Something about being worthy and maintaining their worthiness. They may have had other things in common too, but this is not something that Barristan would be able to, share a beer with Rhaegar over and commiserate on. So, keeping it in the Dayne family, though, right? Well, actually, backing up just a second. So, Arthur may have learned some prophetic things, or they may have discussed prophetic things. Prophecy, supernatural topics may have actually come up between them in a way that Rhaegar would never discuss with Barristan. That said, Joe notes that, yeah, while we can't really expect Barristan to know much about the supernatural side of Rhaegar because he wasn't in the inner circle, he could give us insight into the type of decisions Rhaegar made as a leader, as a politician, and how he handled himself in court. Things that were more at arm's length. And that's a great possibility. Although I'm, like a lot of you, I don't suppose we have a lot of Barristan chapters left in the series. But George can put an awful lot into one chapter, so we'll see. So yeah, now keeping it in the Dayne family, Barristan reminds us of Ned even more when he thinks of Ashara. I'm so curious about this inclusion in Selmy's story. Recall, too, that Ned doesn't think about Ashara even once. And he had a lot of chapters. So maybe George is like circling back to fill out some of this information. But also, notice how Barristan thinks how he would have behaved had he won in Harrenhal. Nina writes some good stuff here. There's a pretty clear calculus in Barristan's head. He's like, it wouldn't have been the queen. It wouldn't have been Elia of Dorne. It would have been, so that means not Rhaella or Elia. So it would have been Ashara. And Nina writes that this is a guy who's really experienced with tournaments. Barristan is a tourney knight. He's also, other things, but if anyone understands like what's normal at a tournament, it's this guy. So dubbing Ashara Queen of Love and Beauty would probably be like standard. It's like, of course he picked someone that looks like that. Instead, Rhaegar, gets weird with this giving it to Lyanna, and it becomes a big scandal. And that's part of why Barristan's like, well, if I had beaten Rhaegar, then that scandal would have been avoided. Now, that is really taking too much responsibility, I would say. Like, Barristan, it wasn't your responsibility to win the tournament. Like, that wasn't, like, required of you. You couldn't have possibly known. Like, it's one thing, when he criticizes himself over Aerys, I think we can find room for saying, yeah, maybe evil was more important than your vows. But that's a separate occasion. We're going to bring up Aemon the Dragon Knight in a minute. And speaking of tournaments and pretending and things like this, he entered a tournament as a mystery knight, the Knight of Tears, to give his sister the laurel of love and beauty. What a guy. What a guy. Now, of course, there's rumors that Aemon and Daenerys were lovers, but I'm on the side of they were not. Doesn't seem too super likely to me, but certainly could be. Anyway. Speaking of rumored affairs, we'll go with Nina's take on this one, too. Brandon is probably the Stark that dishonored Ashara. I totally agree. I don't see Ned as the right personality type for that. Like, Ned getting busy at 16 when he's too shy to even ask the girl to dance. I don't think so. Especially because we're told Brandon's a womanizer. That fits way better, right? Like, way better. Like, womanizer... shy dude. Which one of them do you think slept with her? I mean, it's obviously not 100% certain, but you see why we lean that way. I think it's in that sense, it's like why we guess a certain way is straightforward. The answer may not be, but anyway, it makes sense, right? Barbary Dustin said he put his sword where he wanted. Like, she was not holding back on describing it, right? So interesting to think of it that way. But still, even with all that, it still doesn't give us an answer. Like, we still have massive mystery around Ashara Dayne. And one of the examples of why this is worse, why it's more mysterious, is because he thinks that she killed herself because of her stillborn daughter. But that's like the fourth reason we've been given for why she killed herself. So clearly there's some rumors about, and they may not all be accurate. We were told that she was dishonored, so she did it. We were told that she killed herself because, like, I think it was Cersei who said her child was stolen from her. So there's just all these different versions of the story, and we don't know which one is right. So yeah, that's pretty interesting. The downside of having such a long life of like Barristan is that you get to see the long-term consequences of your actions. Most of us won't have to deal with that too much because we aren't involved in pivotal moments in the history of this country or their country. Our decisions usually don't have this much impact. So this isn't like wondering what life would be like if you married your first crush. But of course, Barristan does have that thought. We're still don't get distracted by the similarity there to Ashara. So Barristan has lived long enough and has been supplied with data on what his actions have led to. So he's kind of like Joe says a similar thing to what I said. He's being unfair to himself, guilting himself over Ashara and this Rhaegar stuff. Like, that's just not your fault, man. Not even close. Many people hypothesize that Barristan will betray or leave Daenerys. I'm open to that theory myself. And the two main reasons that might happen, even though he seems so tied to Dany, is if he sees another disaster unfolding because of her decisions and decides that he can't stomach that, or because his goal has been to follow the true king, and if he becomes convinced that it's actually Aegon, Rhaegar's son. So we'll see about that. Joe points out that again on the subject of Ashara, the only really thing we can nail down about her is that she's not Jon Snow's mother. but most of the other mysteries around her, we've only just added a little more detail to, or more confusion to, in examples like this where we don't even have the story straight. Here's the quote that inspired my chapter title here.
Even after all these years, Ser Barristan could still recall Ashara's smile, the sound of her laughter. He had only to close his eyes to see her, with her long dark hair tumbling about her shoulders and those haunting purple eyes.
So it's another form of guilt, but this is more for his own grief. He doesn't necessarily... well, maybe he thinks that she wouldn't have killed herself if they had gotten together, but who knows? And then this is, again, keep in mind, this is a man with no experience with relationships. This is a celibate person who gave up his inheritance very young. He was so talented that he joined the King's Guard pretty young. He was 23, not incredibly young. So he probably isn't, he's probably had, girlfriend before, but maybe not. Maybe not. He may, be this far in life without ever having that experience. So that makes him rather unqualified to weigh in on other relationships, which is a bit of a thing to miss because you think older person, experience, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but he doesn't have this kind of experience. So don't be too quick to throw that out there. But he does think, so this is why this love and duty theme, very familiar territory for us, needs a grain of salt when we're getting this nice long quote from Barristan and his thoughts on various loves and duties and historical analogs.
Prince Rhaegar loved his lady Lyanna, and thousands died for it. Daemon Blackfyre loved the first Daenerys, and rose in rebellion when denied her. Bittersteel and Bloodraven both loved Shiera Seastar, and the Seven Kingdoms bled. The Prince of Dragonflies loved Jenny of Oldstone so much he cast aside a crown, and Westeros paid the bride price in corpses. All three of the sons of the fifth Aegon had wed for love, in defiance of their father's wishes. And because that unlikely monarch had himself followed his heart when he chose his queen, he allowed his sons to have their way, making bitter enemies where he might have had fast friends. Treason and turmoil followed, as night follows day, ending at Summerhall in sorcery, fire, and grief.
What a quote. Jeez, that is awesome. Talk about a packed bunch of history and mystery. So not just love versus duty, though, like I said. This is unreliable narrator. We saw it already with Barristan in one place where he was wrong about Meraxes. And this quote here isn't there. There's some... Well, let's break it down. Some of it's exaggeration. Some of it's just wrong. Starting with Rhaegar and Lyanna. Did Rhaegar and Lyanna love each other? Maybe. It wasn't the love that probably was really the operating problem, though. It was probably the prophecy chasing is probably why that went so far. That is more like Summerhall, and which is also mentioned here, who that had a lot to do with prophecy and trying to fulfill prophecy. That's probably, Rhaegar and Lyanna probably belong in that category. Daemon Blackfyre loved the first Daenerys, rose in rebellion when denied her. No, that just didn't happen. That just flat out did not happen. He was denied her, and 8 years later, the Blackfyre Rebellion happened. 8 years later. He also had daughters, didn't name any of them Daenerys, and she didn't name any of her children Daemon. I mean, it's not that strong of a connection. It seems like this is exaggerated. There's a lot of reasons the Blackfyre Rebellions happened, and this one, if it's a reason, is a pretty minor one. And I don't think it was a reason at all. I think it might have just been like one small grievance that was added onto the pile, and it was a huge pile of grievances. The Prince of Dragonflies loved Jenny of Oldstone so much that he cast aside a crown. That's true. Westeros paid the bride price in corpses. That's true also. We've been over... We talked about this one in particular in our Summerhall episode, also in some of our Tully coverage, because and Tyrell coverage, because that's some of who those brides were, and husbands. Now, Summerhall, sorcery, fire, and grief, treason and turmoil. Yeah, those things did all happen. There were rebellions. There were all sorts of issues because of that. So he's partly right about that. But that wasn't. Is that love that doomed them, or is it those marriages? That's kind of getting into the weeds. But anyway, Robert's rebellion too. Even if we argue that it was the prophecy that led to so much of this, even that, you I'd still blame Aerys more than anyone else. Aerys is the one who ordered deaths of people. Aerys is the one who demanded the head of Ned Stark. He's the one who burned Rickard to death and strangled Brandon. That guy started the war, guys. Not Rhaegar and Lyanna. I mean, if Rhaegar and Lyanna had never done anything, this is a pretty good chance Aerys would have still triggered some sort of rebellion because he was just operating like an insane man, because he was an insane man and he was violent and possibly traumatized by Summerhall those years ago, which is why he was so into Wildfire. That's just a theory. Another reason to check out a Summerhall episode. But anyway, so you can see Barristan's wrong about a lot of that stuff. But also there's a grain of truth to a lot of it. So again, George is being interesting here. He gives us this long take, but a lot of it's unreliable. And that's another thing that's for us, meaning rereaders. Deep fandom. No way does a first-time reader catch any of that. They read that paragraph and like, oh yeah, love really has caused a lot of problems. Look, sure, these relationships really have done a lot of damage. They're going to miss all that subtext, and there's a lot of it. Kind of almost funny that Miklas runs into the room, this kid, and he doesn't know what to do. He's like, okay, dead Khrazz, Hizdar crying on his knees. I'm supposed to deliver a message to Hizdar, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that, even though he's on his knees, seems to be getting captured here. So it's like he just still goes through the motions. Like, I don't know if you're being thrown in prison here, but I've got a message for you. So anyway, the message is that the dragons are out. And well, that's quite a way to end the chapter, isn't it? What a cool chapter. Real quick too, we've talked about the trainees before. Barristan's young knights. So cool that he has them. Really like that. It's also evident, it's a part of his stubbornness. And I'm not necessarily saying stubborn in a bad context here, that he's so Westerosi, and he really believes in his cultures and traditions. And it's really notable that this Tumco Low, who was dubbed the Basilisk Knight by we had a thread way back in our Facebook group to give this guy a name, and I think that was the most popular choice. That the Barristan considers him the best natural swordsman he's seen since Jaime Lannister. Whoa! Jaime Lannister is, a generational talent. So that is really exceptional. So I think a lot of us are kind of low-key waiting for Tumco Low to get into some action and see what he does. Another cool piece of symbolism noted by Nina, Skahaz chooses a blood bat when he as his mask. Now, blood bat is probably a vampire bat. He can't use the term vampire because vampire is a real-world term, and there's no vampires in A Song of Ice and Fire. So, vampire bats are, a real thing. They drink blood. So that might be the symbolism here is that he's using the bloodshed. He's taking advantage of the bloodshed and chaos to get what he wants, to push his ends. I mentioned the helmet earlier. The helmet's actually pretty important. Barristan not wearing it, I pointed out the symbolic meaning, but it's got double symbolic meaning and some more logistical meaning, and some thematic connections. First of all, he says the helm would limit his eyesight and helps him see things from either side. And, well, Quentin's death next chapter comes in part because his vision is inhibited by his mask. He doesn't see Rhaegal approaching from the side. And Nina wonders if this is also set up for Barristan's own death. Maybe he'll be wearing his helmet when he is surrounded or taken by surprise or something like that. Having helmets with dragon wings on them is not uncommon for Targaryens and their house guards and things like that. Daemon Blackfire had dragon wings on his. Maekar had dragon teeth on his. Valar had a gleaming three-headed dragon wings on his helm. Aemon the Dragon Knight was called the Dragon Knight because of his dragon helm. And in this case, the dragon helm being left is symbolic, perhaps, of the dragons being left unguarded by Barristan. Barristan, of all the things Barristan's thinking about, it doesn't occur to him to put extra guards on the dragons, even though they're being threatened. Skahaz thinks of that, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. But leaving the dragon helm behind is kind of like forgetting about them. Of course, we mentioned the password. This is Grolio is the password that Quentin doesn't get, but here in this chapter, Barristan hears that that's what the password is. Of course, Quentin hears that the password is dog, and that leads to problems. Okay, so there's another clue that the locust came from the shave pate. He says the following. He's not only, when they meet the second time, he dresses the brazen beast as locusts and says, I got more locusts if you need them. Jeez. It's like taunting the guy to his face because he's not going to pick up on it. It's Nina says it's kind of like Littlefinger doing that to Ned back in a Game of Thrones. Also, we have this other point. I lost my place. Anyway, Guilty Undertaker says, it was only on reread that I remembered that Barristan was old enough to be Ashara's father at Harrenhal. Yeah, he was 47 when she died.
And she was between 14 and 23. Let's go ahead and say she's not on that young end of things. That's just, on the wiki, they have to give technically
the 1% chance or whatever.
But let's say she's in the middle. She's 20 and he's 47.
Yeah, that's not abnormal for Westeros, but that is a huge age gap.
Yeah, just the idea of him like kind of fantasizing about her and dreaming about her. It has a different tone when you think of him. And
that's
he's
true.
Almost 50 and is her.
But he doesn't sexualize her. He thinks about her eyes, but you're right. But still, it does give it a different tone.
Yeah.
Also, it's the guilt of
I do
her death.
think of Barristan is a lot younger then.
Yeah,
like,
but he wasn't really that young.
Yeah, he wasn't young, but I do think of him still as young at that time period. So it's a good reminder.
But he is young in terms of relationships. Like he's never had never had love. So it probably he probably still has that naivete in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a while since I mentioned Roy Dotrice, but since we're talking about older characters, I'll give him a shout here. His Barristan is really good. His Khrazz is good. His Hizdar is good. His Shave Pate's excellent. Chapters like these that don't have a lot of female voices, because old guy doing female voices, shocking that doesn't go off so well. But chapters like this, it works pretty well. We had a little parallel moment there when he thinks of being a soiled knight, which is exactly what Aris Oakhart's solo chapter is called, The Soiled Knight. And it's soiled because he's playing the Game of Thrones and getting involved in a coup that similar thing. Like Barristan's getting involved in a coup, and that's why he feels soiled, of course. And in both cases, they're being very misled by the person that's pushing them towards the coup. Aris Oakhart was very much misled by Arianne, and seems like Barristan's being misled by Skahaz. Tree Girl with another nice little subtle small catch that might turn out to be bigger later. Missandei, Barristan notes, has been deep into reading scrolls and books. And, well, maybe that means she'll become friends with Tyrion. Yeah, that's cool. He also thinks to himself that one day his knights will understand chivalry. And the knights, a lot of y'all are skeptical about that. Maybe the Hound is going to be the one whose philosophy comes out right there. The knights are just killers. The rest is just to pretty it all up. So, yeah, I'm not sure that they will learn chivalry someday, but maybe they will. Barristan is not a bigot. He doesn't mock other cultures, as we've seen in recent chapters, through things like Northerners calling R'hllor Ralu and Arch calling all the Giscari Harzu. But just the same, he doesn't get it. He's respectful in some ways, but it's a strange form of stubbornness / arrogance where he just doesn't try to fit in. He doesn't try to change anything. He's just, I'm Westerosi. I'm not going to try to be like these people at all. Dany shows a lot more willingness to adjust, but of course she was never ingrained in Westerosi culture in the first place. She's never even been there. So it's easier for her. We wonder where the rumor that Ashara had a daughter specifically came from. Why does Barristan think that? Nina suggests maybe because he was at court, there was letters exchanged. Maybe Elia, because Elia was close to Ashara, meaning that she may have been close to the Danes. Obviously, Arthur was around at court. So there's some potentials. Arthur wouldn't have been around at court then. But the Dane connection to court was there still. And maybe there was some of that talk. Who knows? Thomas Pappas, our good friend, asked, would Barristan have stopped Rhaegar and Arthur if they had actually tried to overthrow Aerys? That's a great question. It touches on what kind of, like, how much we should judge Barristan for his past actions as compared to, say, Jaime, someone he very much judges. He does not like Jaime because Jaime's the Kingslayer. But
What do you think? I think he would have stopped them under most circumstances, but that there are circumstances where he wouldn't have stopped.
yeah, it
them.
really depends on if Aerys had like done something else.
Or if like Aerys was trying to kill the rest of the royal family.
Yeah,
like, that
yeah.
kind of maybe trumps it all. If he's trying to kill 5 members of his family, well.
So we can't know without the other circumstances. But let's say there is a very good chance that Barristan would have sided with Aerys and then felt terrible about it. Even during it. Not even then, just during it. He's like, well, but my oath is more important, you know.
Yeah, I don't think he would have felt good during that.
Yeah. And a dark but also pleasing, perhaps optimistic thought about Barristan's end, which may be coming soon, from Oberyn19 on our Flick channel says, Barristan's death will be tragic, but hopefully he realizes that he can rest now. His lessons on vigilance really show how little break in life this man has ever had, and that is one thing death will give him. Well said. On to the Dragontamer. The gang does not steal a dragon, aka the one with the Burninating. The reference to Burninating is to a YouTube show channel called Homestar Runner. They had a episode and a character called Trogdor the Burninator, who was a dragon, and you could actually even play the Trogdor Burninating video game. The YouTube channel, if you're familiar with Homestar Runner, they're actually from our area here near Atlanta. They're from Duluth, Georgia.
I
Which,
wonder how many people listening are too young for that now versus how many are too old and in the sweet spot.
Yeah, I wonder how people have actually heard of Homestar Runner or how under the radar of a reference that is. So comment if you're familiar. It's not like it's just the Sacrifice and Victarion 1. Those 2 chapters didn't have enough people getting burned for us. Talk about a different type of climactic buildup. You got smaller burnings building up to a dragonfire burning. Just like all those rituals progressed in intensity by having the POV's participation ramp up. Start off by watching, start off by targeting, then Cersei is the victim, kind of the centerpiece of it all. Now we have a POV centerpiece themselves burned after seeing several POVs witness burnings. This is a time where Cersei doesn't mind being one-upped. That said, this surely isn't the last death by burning or dragonfire or otherwise, and others will have their shot to steal Quentin's dragon, or thunder, or Thunder Dragon? Let's get started.
The night crept past on slow black feet.
A Thunder Dragon would have slow black feet, but loud black feet. There's a reason this chapter starts with an emphasis on time. We already know from the Kingbreaker that it is around the hour of the wolf, or slightly later, that Barristan learned the dragons had escaped. And since this chapter is called the Dragontamer, it's obvious it is going to be Quentin's actions that, cause all this to happen. That's why it's really neat that George put the escape of the dragons before the actual episode with the dragon escape. We've seen George give the answer before he gives the riddle, and this is sort of that concept. Definitely an inversion or a structural similarity there. More connections between Barristan and Quentin come with their experience with women, rather lack of such. It's tragic in a sense for them both. Barristan is missing out on that life experience entirely, even as he imagines Ashara, Dayne and what could have been, while Quentin is thinking about how he might not survive the night, and he's never, thinking about kissing the Drinkwater twins and things like that. It's so mean for George to have Quentin's lips literally burned off as one of the descriptions. So, in Barristan's next chapter. So yeah, it's just that's what comes of your thoughts of kissing there, Quentin. And he's holding his hand over that candle flame and it brings it back. And Nina points out how that recalls the beginning of the book. Jon and Gilly, and Jon telling Gilly to put her hand over the flame so she knows what the child will have to face and what they're trying to avoid. Pretty bad. Just, there's so much in this scene that when you read it, it's like with the Red Wedding. When you read it the first time, it's so much happening at once. You probably don't catch all the details, but when you reread it and you're slowing it down a little and looking for the foreshadowing, it's like, wow, it is everywhere. It's like the Red Wedding, and it's going to be the same in the next chapter, Jon Stabbening, where it's just like, whoa, there really was a lot pointing to this, wasn't there? He thinks and thinks about what he wants to do with his life, experiences that he hasn't had, how much he misses his friends. So, boy, it's tragic because when you read that the first time, you don't know that he's never going to have those things. Basically, there's just a lot of things that round up here what makes Quentin Quentin. It's like a summary of who he is, which Joe points out. When a character is thinking about getting home from the front line, it normally means they don't. And yeah, I guess that's certainly the case here. Garrus had tried a number of tactics, good cop, bad cop, encouragement, insulting, to try to get Quentin to stop. None of it works. Just Arch tries to. He talks about it in more of a symbolic way, more of a supernatural way. He talks about bad luck of it raining. He talks about Aegon V or Aegon IV and his wooden dragons, which was one of the worst attempts to invade Dorne ever, making it a nice pairing for this horrible attempt to steal a dragon. Aegon IV literally wheeled wooden dragons into Dorne, which is with all its mountains and sand, that these things shot wildfire, and predictably they never got all the way to Dorne before being destroyed. So pretty weak. They were set on fire themselves because they were made of wood. So his own dragons were set on fire. And look at this line. Gosh, it's just so painful.
This will be my grand adventure.
Men die on grand adventures.
He was not wrong. That was in the stories, too. The hero sets out with his friends and companions, faces dangers, comes home triumphant. Only some of his companions don't return at all. The hero never dies, though. I must be the hero.
He's not wrong. That is, we've all seen that trope a bajillion times. The hero sets out with friends and faces danger, comes home triumphant, and some of his friends don't make it, or her. Same thing. He's totally right. But he's also right that he needs to be the hero, but he isn't. And what's Nina writes, it's one of the many aspects of this tragedy is that he doesn't really want to be a hero. He wants to succeed for Dorne. But it's not like his goals are heroic in terms of his life. The things he wants to do after this is go home and get married and go in tournaments. His expectations for life after this are of a fairly normal life. He wants to settle down and do normal things. He's not trying to be like, then I'll go on to my next heroic adventure. Yeah, he's just not. He has the attitude of a fairly normal person. Been in a very not normal situation. It's almost a little bit reminiscent of Stannis in how Stannis says, I don't want to be king. It's my duty. I have to do it. Stannis may not entirely be honest about that. Subconsciously, maybe he really does want it. I feel like that's part of it. And it might be the same case with Quentin. Part of Quentin wants to be seen as a hero. Everyone wants to be celebrated on some level. But ultimately, the duty is the thing that they're leaning into, and it might be the thing that is motivating them the most. And something else that he has in common with Stannis is this belief about dragons, mistaken belief, meaning that in Stannis' case, of course, he's been convinced that he's going to wake dragon from stone, or that he's this prophesied hero. And Quentin sort of acts like he's the only one that has the blood to claim a dragon. The hero Quentin represents here, in a legendary sense, is none other than Azor Ahai. As we said in the Kingbreaker chapter, these two chapters together serve as a to put all the ingredients together for Azor Ahai. Young Griff is likely a false dragon. Quentin, I suppose, to be sort of false Azor Ahai, trying to master the flame in light of R'hllor that's held deep in the dungeons of these shadows down here in the darkness. It's a stone prison containing dragons, right? Unleashing them on the world is definitely a form of waking dragons from stone in a non-literal but quite literary manner. Jon is stabbed to, quote, save the world, which, of course, the Night's Watch officers also think they're doing the right thing. There's lots of people doing what they perceive to be the right thing. But pretty much all of them are operating with incomplete information. Another interesting symbol here is pyramids in the real world were almost exclusively used as tombs, not grain storage. So I suppose that's a fitting aspect to this for Quentin. He goes down to the base of the pyramid and dies. Technically, he dies in Dany's bed, but he's killed down in the darkness of the pyramid. He suffers his mortal wounding down there. Joe puts down this is really one of the most daring things done in the entire series, trying to steal a dragon. We can call it fantastically brave or fantastically stupid, but maybe both. Yeah, let's call it both.
We're going to see a lot of that in House of the Dragon.
Yeah, you're right. We're going to see some Quentin-type figures. We're going to see some Quentining. We're going to see some...
Yeah, are we going to, just real quick, as I mentioned, are we going to see some people get torched trying to tame them? Yes.
I think so. Sheep Stealer's going to eat some people.
Yeah,
We'll
just
see...
some red shirts and people we don't know.
Yeah, it's going to
anyways.
happen. You're right. We're going to see some Quentins. Lots of Quentins coming up next year. 2022 will be full of Quentins. And here's another thing. Here's an important quote to help explain Quentin's view of himself and his role.
They do not understand. They may be Dornish, but I am Dorn. Years from now, when I am dead, this will be the song they sing of me.
This is part of why I'm thinking, part of him does kind of want to be a hero. He likes this idea, but it's the same kind of thing. The song they sing is not going to be the song he was thinking of. He's probably not wrong. This is a famous incident. It may be recorded. It may be noted in the history books, and there may be songs about it. It does have that sort of feel to it. I could see if I was a bard, I'd be like, yeah, I'd be all over this one. So he's right, but it's the wrong songs. Now,
Real quick, do you think it would be a humorous song, a sad song?
I think it would be. There'd be both. There'd be versions of it that are
okay. Yeah.
Yeah. In Dorne, it would be a sad
yeah,
song.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking.
But like in the Stormlands, they'd be laughing at this dude. in the Reach, they're like, "Look at this idiot." So here's where I bring back a theory that I mentioned that remember how easily the Tattered Prince and the Windblown are able to get in and out of Meereen? And their connection to that woman Zarina, who is a Meereenese slaver. We talked about the possibility, and we talked about Barristan's unease about masks. And in this scene, we see why the masks make him uneasy, and we see why. Well, first of all, I suggested the possibility that the Tattered Prince and the Windblown were involved with the Sons of the Harpy in helping the nightly murders. And we get strong evidence that might be the case here. After all, where does this bad password come from? According to them, they captured a brazen beast and tortured him for it. That dude died, most certainly. And then the next day, after the dragons are released, and Hizdahr is taken into custody, in Barristan's final chapter, the Sons of the Harpy start murdering again, and we get a count. It's like this many people were killed in the night. This brazen beast is probably included in that count. Because, well, he was killed, and it was all around the same time. And this brazen beast was killed nowhere, not in the dragon's pit. So, in the dungeon there. So, they wouldn't necessarily connect it to that. So, two things about that real quick. One, it shows us perhaps the failure of torture as a method, especially for something like this. Like, torture could work for something like, hey, give me your PIN number, or I torture you. Like, you can tell that the PIN number didn't work, so you could just go back to torturing them until they give you the right one. But this... They don't get to test their information before using it. So, this son of the harp or this brazen beast may have given them a bad password because he knew he could get away with that. So so this is why I think maybe the Windblown are involved in these nightly murders. After all, they have skills at killing, and well, here they'd go capturing a brazen beast, as if they've maybe done this before. And Nina says it's a stomach drop moment when Quentin sees that the brazen beast guarding the door of the dragon's pit are all wearing locust masks. He doesn't know what that means. Neither do the Windblown, neither do Arch or Garrus. What it means is that these are Skahaz's men specifically. Remember what he said to Barristan. I've got more locusts if you need them. The locusts are his inside operatives. And this is what I was talking about when I said Hizdahr thought this through and Barristan didn't, meaning protect the dragons. Don't let someone sneak in and kill the dragons. Hizdahr doesn't know. Skahaz doesn't know what's going on here. He didn't say, guard the dragons unless someone comes to steal them. If someone comes to let them out, go ahead and let them do that. These brazen beasts were ordered to keep someone from killing the dragons. And here comes a bunch of sellswords and other dudes impersonating them, showing up. They're going to assume the Windblown and Quentin are there to kill the dragons, not capture them. They don't know. they've been warned about people trying to murder the dragons. So that's what they're going to think is happening here. And that's why they don't just go, oh, okay, whatever, wrong password, I don't care. Unlike the outer door guards who were not wearing locust masks and were not in the inner circle of what's happening. So that can be confusing, but broken down like that, it's actually really quite sensible. It makes total sense, doesn't it? Of course, his daughter doesn't want the dragons killed. Khrazz doesn't want the dragons killed, so he puts guards in the door. They're indicated by their locust masks, and neither of these groups knows what the other group is up to. Quentyn doesn't know that these are Khrazz's men, that they're protecting the dragons for Dany, and vice versa. So these guys, had they been able to explain themselves to each other, it might have gone a lot differently. Nina writes also, and I agree, it's one of the most anguished moments in the series. Before he even gets inside the doors and sees 4 dead people, he thinks, Father, why? Like, he's realizing something that he's expressing something that a lot of people have expressed in the comments and about Doran Martell, that he sent a very unprepared son on a very dangerous mission. And this expectation, or this result, perhaps should have been more expected. Like, Doran should maybe not have done this in the first place. This is too much to ask for his inexperienced son to go win the mother of dragons to their cause, right? So, but it's his duty, and he didn't feel like he had a choice, and that's why he's like, why do I have to do this? Father, why did you put me in this position? And that anguish really comes out on the page, and it's painful. Poor kid. And how can he go in and face a dragon if he can't face these 4 bodies? But he does. So give the kid credit. He's got a bad plan, but this is brave, brave, brave. Even after things start to go worse, even after the plan is clearly not working the way they expected, even after crucial milestones are not hit, for example, feed the dragons, get them sleepy. Instead, someone shoots a crossbow bolt at them. That's the opposite of making them sleepy. That makes them agitated. There was plenty of opportunities to say, okay, never mind. Quentyn never really seems to have entertained the notion that they would abort the mission. It didn't enter his mind before or during. To him, it was do or die, but he wasn't really thinking fully about the die. He just expected it to work. So, it's very much a hell description. A wash of sudden heat assaulted them, heavy with the odors of ash, brimstone, and burnt meat. And it's like, whoa, yeah. Hell indeed. We've seen lots of hell metaphors all throughout Slaver's Bay. This is one of the more direct ones. Instead of people, it's the dragons this time. The atmosphere of this scene is incredible. George's descriptions, he does some of his best work. He's so good at this kind of thing. I'm going to highlight the dragons because they're among the best of it.
2 eyes rose up before him. Bronze they were, brighter than polished shields, glowing with their own heat, burning behind a veil of smoke rising from the dragon's nostrils.
Yeah, so that is so cool. And then, of course, after the crossbow is shot off, Viserion doesn't wait to retaliate, bites the dude, bites his head off. Maris and other people run away, and they're like, yeah, this is a bad idea. They abort because they see it going wrong. Quentyn presses forward, and because he sees, okay, here's my opportunity. This is my chance. And, of course, it wasn't really an opportunity. And a little bit of a parallel to Daznak's Pit. Barristan afterwards is like, I just stood there yelling. I yelled at the dragon, tried to get its attention, but I didn't actually approach it. Garrus and Arch, kind of the same thing. All they can do is yell. Even the bravest men, ones we've seen not hesitate in tough spots, ones we know have faced extreme danger. Dragons are just a whole different kind of terrifying. A quick plug for our Patreon that I don't normally point out is that every episode document has a lot more in it that I don't say. Nina and Joe add a lot of thoughts that we just don't have time for all of them. Some of them I just have to leave out. It's painful to not say it all because some of it's really good. But if you are a patron at the $4 or $10 or above levels, some of them have it, access to scripts come in, and you can check this stuff out. Check some of the unspoken of points that are in here. Nina also writes, it's kind of an ironic moment when Arch breaks the chains of the doors, keeping the dragon secure. This is the closest Quentin and his crew come and will come to meeting what Daenerys wanted. Stealing a dragon's not what she wanted, but letting them out when they're in danger, that would have actually been in line with her goals. Knowing that they're in danger, well, they're in a lot less danger now. Certainly being trapped in a room makes them a lot more of a target. So it's kind of accidental that they're doing it, and it's in a way that is symbolically fitting, breaking the chains, right? That's much is made of Arch's repeated hammering of the lock and chains to break the door down, and all the noise it makes. And they're like, gosh, that is so loud. And also a very under the radar little subtle moment happens with that man that Viserion eats. He's wearing a tiger mask, and the tiger mask melts. So a dragon eating a tiger. Remember, the Volantines' war party is the tigers. And Volantis is coming. They're on their way to Slaver's Bay now. And, well, we don't expect them to win, so the dragons probably will beat the tigers, and it probably will involve a lot of burning and freeing of slaves. Shout out to our friend Robert, a.k.a. In Deep Geek, who cited, and thanks to some of our Flick commenters for pointing this out, that Robert cited the line, men's lives have meanings, not their deaths, from prior Quentin chapters. Quentin's death is perhaps an exception to that rule, because his death is going to have a lot of meaning. The fallout won't be minor. In fact, it might drive Dorne away from Daenerys as an ally, which is a huge change, even though she's completely blameless. She wasn't even there. She didn't suggest this plan of action to Quentin. He kind of thought she did, but she definitely didn't. And that might be why they go with part of why they go with young Griff instead. Great take by John Hagee here. The quote, "It was black beyond the doors, a sullen Stygian darkness that seemed alive and threatening, hungry." Stygian is, of course, a reference to the river Styx from Greek myth. Crossing the river Styx is crossing into the land of the dead, and that is very much what Quentin does here. There's the line about the dragon, a roar that would have sent 100 lions running. Quentin is wearing a lion mask in this scene, and they make a point of describing which mask is which. Remember, the Garrus says, that makes a monkey out of me when he wears the ape mask. George tries to put a little humor into this very not humorous chapter. And I will also try to add a little humor as we close this chapter out. Here's one that George could not possibly have seen coming. He could never have known that amidst plague and mask wearing, we'd get a line that resonates in modern times so well right here.
Garrus pressed the ape mask to his face. How do they breathe in these things?
Just put it on.
The prince was in no mood for japes.
Oh, the pale mare and mask. Just put it on. How do we breathe in these? That is too real, y'all. Too real. That mask did save Quentin's life, too. I mean, it didn't matter because he died anyway. But remember, Garrus pushes him out of the way as a spear thrust is coming right at his face. And it still strikes him. It strikes the mask. So it probably would have struck his cheek instead. Anyway. So there you go, masks. They work even when they're not brass. John 13. Darkwing's Pink Words, aka the one with the stabbening. Lucky number 13, right? On the heels of a big fiery climax over on the other side of the world, the wintry Thunderland at the wall is aiming to match that intensity. I'd say it does, if not more so. Like Quentin's death in the immediately preceding chapter, for most, Jon's death is a massive shock when you experience it for the first time. On reread, you're not unlikely to be overwhelmed by how much setup and foreshadowing there was for it. Again, like the Red Wedding. Ghost, by himself, just Ghost's reactions in this chapter alone are enough to be like, yep, there it was. But just like it was with Grey Wind, right? Grey Wind alone was enough to say, uh-oh. But also, like Grey Wind, there was more than Grey Wind. There was the drums and the rain and Catelyn and other things. And here, ditto. There's a lot of things, and it wasn't all this chapter. It was built up before this chapter. Also, ditto the Red Wedding. Also, ditto Quentin's death. And this chapter also has a lot more than that, though, too. This chapter is enormously full. I think maybe this chapter has now surpassed many of the others in terms of most comments. Although I didn't count, and of course I'm not going to. But it's neat to point out when it happens that certain chapters are just like really more than others stand out. There's so much to say about all these chapters, but this one, whew. Here's just a list. And I'm sure I'm missing a thing or two, maybe several things, of items that come to a head, plot lines or subplots that come to a head in this chapter, or that become additionally foreshadowed to matter. Final decisions on Hardhome, notation that all the ships are gone and all the men, pink letter meaning news of the Battle of Ice and Stannis possibly being dead, and all the things that rumors causes, even though it's not true. And the reveal that Mance's still alive. That's a big one. The free folk learned that, and so do a lot of other people who didn't know that. John's belief that Ramsay has Arya and that she's escaped. That's a mistaken impression. It certainly drives him to act. Ghost and Melisandre and the Ravens all have some, and the one Raven rather has agitations over his doom. John's frustration with the officers in Melisandre really comes to a head, and vice versa. And of course, the actual stabbing is part of that. Patrick tries to claim Val, and that leads to a confrontation with 1-1. And then there's other foreshadowed things like Krieg and Karstark's presence there that gets brought up, and that might matter. The stored corpses and chains, and then circling back to Hardhome, the aftermath from that might be referred to here. There's some cryptic language here that we can't fully get to the bottom of, and so we have to apply a few caveats here to what's happening in this chapter, meaning some of the things that might be foreshadowed here we haven't caught on to. That's always the possible thing here. Now, we've talked about Cersei chapters having so much, this last Barristan chapter having so much, but this is one of the biggest of them all. The Battle of Ice, Battle of Fire, Battle of Blood, and whatever battles Aegon and the Golden Company get involved in early next book or mid next book or late next book, those are all coming and soon. But the conflicts, battles or otherwise, that are going to break out here at the Wall after this, and it's an impossible amount of them to track and keep track of, could prove to be the most interesting of them all. Your mileage may vary, but which one you end up preferring after the fact, who knows at this point, but surely this one is the hardest to predict. Right? Like, I think we have a decent sense of who's going to win the Battle of Ice and Battle of Fire and Battle of Blood. And a lot of us, I think, are pretty confident that the Golden Company is at least going to have enough victories to take King's Landing. And then after that, who knows? But what the heck is going to happen at the Wall after all this? It's just too many moving pieces. And I wouldn't say complicated. Complicated is the wrong word. It's just like imperceptible. You can't predict, like unperceivable. I don't think complicated, because complicated, it kind of implies that you can figure it out, and this isn't, you can't figure this out. It's also really tragic, too, because all along, a big underlying theme of Game of Thrones is that the world of humanity is fighting itself when it should be joining together to face this great evil emerging from the north that threatens everyone. But in line with our "it can always get worse" theme that always seems to strike at the best/worst possible times, this is the place where humanity's survival is most perhaps set to be determined. At least the characters believe that. And it's already undermanned, understaffed, underappreciated. And now they're just fighting each other. And it starts with a line that really gets to that point, doesn't it?
"Let them die," said Queen Selyse.
Now, she's talking about the free folk, but we could apply that to, humanity. If they're going to behave that way, then this is what you're paving the road towards. She may as well be speaking about everyone. Let us die. Joe writes, so Selyse's lore-based platitudes of how this might be better for them in a very similar way to what Victarion said of the slave girls he sent out to burn gives John a bit of an issue. Yeah, I could have written it that way, and y'all might have been able to. Oh, I bet Joe wrote that. That's a very British British style of understatement. You do think John has a bit of an issue with just let them die? Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, that is true, and it's ironic too because Selyse is constantly surrounded by guards because she's worried about what the free folk will do to her. Yet it's one of those very guards that starts trouble with one at the end of the chapter. Now, as for this Hardhome question, of course, Selyse is like, she doesn't have any say in the matter, as she acknowledges. She's like, yeah, you're in charge here, but you're going to have to answer to Stannis when he comes back, because that's the ultimate person in charge, of course, according to her. And, but she is at least pleased that he's leading the mission, because like a lot of people, like perhaps the Night's Watch officers, they'd be like, yeah, go ahead and die, man, if you want to, let you die. They're fine with that. And Patchface volunteers to lead the mission himself. The room bursts into laughter. And, well, I wouldn't be laughing at this quote. It's a bit spooky, and it's one of the less confusing Patchface quotes, which maybe that's not saying much, but anyway, here it is.
We will march into the sea and out again. Under the waves we will ride seahorses, and mermaids will blow seashells to announce our coming. Oh, oh, oh. 3 O's.
Of course, he always says oh 3 times, but still, when it's immediately preceding a line about blowing seashells, it sounds like 3 blasts of the horn, right? So is he saying, march into the sea and out again, they'll come back as whites. The mermaids will blow seashells to announce they're coming. They'll blow the horns to say the whites are coming, the others are coming. Again, what does under the sea mean? 2 different interpretations that work pretty well of that are during winter or as an undead, meaning you will enter the realm of the undead, which is what, and of course the wall as a big frozen wall of water kind of works as crossing over to the other side is kind of like marching into the sea. But again, we're never sure about Patchface. So this is why it's too bad. As much as we don't want to agree with Selyse, and as much as you don't want to co-sign that attitude, she's probably right. You probably can't. I mean, let them die is a bad way to make the argument, and this is a chapter that really shows the power of bad arguments. That if you had said this differently, whether it's Selyse, whether it's Jon, whether it's the Night's Watch officers, there's a lot of different people that make arguments that, had they been said differently, might have worked. Right? Sometimes it's really about how you present the argument, not the content of the meaning. For example, Nina points out that the Fist of the First Men is like 270 some miles from Castle Black. Hardhome's a little less than that. That's really far. And worse, what are they going to do when they get there? It's already bad. There's people dead already, people starving already. The free folk women are like, no, you're slavers. We won't go with you. It does sound hopeless. And it's worse than hopeless because if you send men to stop it and they fail, then they are now whites also, and you've just empowered your enemy even more. So, that's too bad because, Selyse is probably right, even if it's for the wrong reasons. And then Melisandre backs up the argument using some of her flame readings to supply evidence, and Jon disagrees because he's like, well, you're wrong sometimes. Look, that doesn't mean she's wrong this time, and etc. So, yeah, that's another big overarching part of this chapter. Jon becoming impatient, understandably, but it guides his decisions, and it's part of why some of his arguments aren't great and why he should have maybe taken time to frame them differently. Because they're good at their core, they're just presented poorly. I want to make sure that's clear. Another important thing that happens in this opening scene, is the marriages. Selyse is doing what queens do very often, arranging marriages. And there's a very interesting under the radar theme here that Nina caught. Axel brings in Garrett Kingsblood, and he is really nicely dressed up. Jon thinks, boy, he wouldn't be out of place at King's Landing at court. The way he looks nice. And Axel is the one that told the story of the Targaryen princeling dressing up their child as an ape and comparing that. And then he tells that story, as we said at the time, to insult Davos, to say Davos as a commoner, even as with a lord's title, is still an ape. That's basically what he was saying. However, comes full circle as, what do you think Axel thinks of wildlings compared to commoners like Davos? Probably not much different, right? Yet this guy, here we have this guy that pretty much fits what Axel would say is dressing up an ape. I obviously don't co-sign that sentiment, but under different circumstances, Axel would be saying that. But because it's on his team, because he's the beneficiary of this, he's marrying one of Garrick's daughters, if I remember correctly, while Val is going to marry Patrick. Well, she's not because he's dead, but that is what's laid out here in this opening scene. So yeah, good. So that's pretty cool. Nina suspects that George is just throwing that back in Axel's face, and to any human that has that kind of sentiment about nobles being better, that culture, that class is not a sign of greater humanity. This is also a little like Barristan's stubbornness at not adapting, meaning this cultural stuff, how they just refuse to accept how wildling culture works, and they're just like, nope. We're going to teach her. Val's going to learn to kneel and be a wife to her lord husband. Garrick Kingsblood is the rightful king of the free folk because of his lineage. They're like, okay. But they're insisting this is how it's going to be. They're forcing this culture on other people rather than adapting. And this is kind of like, but I don't want to say that Barristan was doing that. Barristan was not adapting, but he wasn't doing the forcing nearly as much. I wouldn't call the forcing of his training on young kids that kind of forcing. For one thing, they're not required to participate, so they're not being forced. Anyway, so Jon is like, look, this Val Sir Patrick thing is not going to go the way you want. And then it really, really doesn't go the way anyone wants. Far different than what we expected. Fast forward to these marriages later, though, right? We already know the Patrick marriage isn't happening because he's dead, but what about Axel and the Garrick Kingsblood's daughter and all these other things? Like, these marriages were arranged before they get the news that Stannis was defeated. Now, obviously, Stannis wasn't defeated, but we're wondering what people are going to do based on the information they have. They're not going to operate on information they don't have. So the actual truth isn't important because they don't know it. So what matters is what they think is the truth. So yeah, Melisandre backs up Selyse, and this is what she says.
Your ships are lost, all of them. Not a man shall return. I have seen that in my fires.
Not a man? Is that a way of saying that whites or undead men will come? I don't know. Maybe
all the women
there.
Somehow.
Yeah, it's just all women. Yeah.
We are not men.
It's a Spearwife army. Where did that come from? But really, Mel's flame readings aside, it does seem like a suicide mission. Like I said, there's no way you can do that. But then Mel has this very odd comment. I just don't understand it. Even though Jon is starting to reject Melisandre's power because he's frustrated with her being wrong and he's frustrated that she doesn't agree with him, he's a little bit petty here. He does, by the end of the chapter, realize that, well, I should go back to her because maybe she can tell me where Ramsay is. He's like, so he clearly hasn't fully given up on her. He just doesn't have a chance to actually do that because he dies first. But look at this weird comment she makes. I don't know what to make of this.
All your questions shall be answered. Look to the skies, Lord Snow. And when you have your answers, send to me. Winter is almost upon us now. I am your only hope.
Help me, Obi-Wan Snowby. Can Snowby. But I don't know what that means. What does look to the skies mean? Is that the pink letter that's about to arrive? Is that what she's talking about? That's what Jon thinks. Jon interprets it that way when the letter comes. He's like, oh, that's what she was talking about. But he might be wrong. We don't have to assume he's right about that. Some of y'all think it's an indication that an attack is coming, meaning from the whites, which could relate to Hardhome. But honestly, there's almost certainly an attack coming regardless of whether this quote is foreshadowing it. So it's very cryptic. Very cryptic. Speaking of crypts, George loves to hit us with these deep but very brief moments, and one in particular I like here a lot is Borok, the skin changer, the guy with the boar, going to live in a tomb, aka a crypt, at Castle Black temporarily. It sounds a bit creepy, but this is a man who by nature has to be solitary because skin changers are not exactly embraced even amongst the free folk. There's a respect of sorts among, of skin changers amongst the free folk because of the belief that their powers come from the old gods and they all worship the old gods, but still there's a wariness that comes with that, Tree Girl suggests that a skin changer among the graves is foreshadowing for Jon becoming an undead skin changer, and I definitely like that take. South of the Wall, well, there's a reason why there are very few skin changers south of the Wall anymore. They don't die of old age down there either. Marsh makes a ridiculous claim that they should be wary of Borok's possible ability to make a whole pig army. First of all, we know that only powerful skin changers can control multiple animals at a time, and this guy has one boar. He's not Borok 6 tusks, let alone Borok 1,000 tusks. Second, if he could summon so many pigs at once, by all means, do so. Food is scarce, man. Bring in the pigs. Eat them. Now, Borok recognizes that he won't be popular, and it's almost like he's leaning into that, like Tyrion says. Tyrion's like, the world will not forget that you're a skin changer, so don't try to deny it of yourself. So Borok's like, well, may as well go live in the crypt. So people, if people are going to be afraid of me, I may as well lean into that. That way, the people who are so afraid of me, they might want to kill me, maybe are scared off. And of course, his giant boar helps with that. It's also symbolic for skin changers themselves. They're a relic of a dying age. It's kind of appropriate to couch this in a graveyard. And most of the world thinks they are completely dead. Well, most of the world thinks they're completely long gone and a thing of the past. And it's fair to say that the trend of skin changers dying out will continue. They probably won't have some sort of renaissance. And of course, a different skin changer will be stabbed most prominently in this chapter, and by denying his skin changer nature is part of what leads to it. Of course, it's a lot more complicated than that, but it's of course highly notable that Jon doesn't have Ghost with him when he's stabbed. And that's part of the tragedy, because part of the reason he leaves Ghost away is because he thinks the boar is agitating him. The boar did agitate him, but Jon doesn't even consider that there's anything else that could be agitating Ghost. And that is a sad dot to connect, that Jon's fear of the skin changer animals killing each other is why he doesn't protect himself from getting killed. Yeah, it's sad, but great writing. Jon is lonely. The men who are close to him are in danger, and he's been a champion of accepting the free folk himself. He's above so much else. Jon's ability to stand above the bigotry and prejudices of his own culture are almost unique. There's other characters that are like this, like Dany. But both of them do not fully realize how much more prejudice is in other humans around them. I think they don't realize that gap. So Borok would have been a useful person to Jon to learn from. Like, he could have chatted skin changer tech with him. He may have even been an ally. I'm not saying they would have been friends, but they at least have something in common that's really rare. And that's tragic too. It's also maybe something to criticize Jon for. Jon chastises Othel Yarwick for not working harder to get the free folk to work with his men. He's like, look, you got to make this connection. You got to build this bridge. We have to work with them and they have to work with us. I didn't see Jon trying to work with Borok, though. I mean, he was busy, but still, I wonder if he would have eventually gone on that same track himself. So I feel Jon's frustration. I feel like it's possible for the free folk to work with the Night's Watch, but they just don't seem to be trying. They're like, nah, it's never going to work. They don't seem to be putting in the effort. They don't seem to be, they're fatalistic. But it's possible Yarwick is right. It's possible Yarwick has tried, and it's just not going to happen. They just hate each other too much. These aren't recruits. Like, Jon might be thinking of how surly he was when he was trained and how it all worked out. But those were recruits. They wear the black cloak. These free folk very few of them actually took the black. These are uneasy allies. Yeah, I'm glad I don't have Jon's decisions to make. I don't know what the heck I would do. So I had maybe a small oversight. I pointed out the Raven wasn't really getting involved in warnings for Jon. I'm going to partially stick to that, but Jon does notice that the Raven does seem agitated as well, meaning when Ghost is agitated, and it's right when they're meeting with the officers who, kill him later in the chapter. So it certainly serves as foreshadowing, but as far as supernatural warnings go, it's very light. After all, the bird just yells snow, 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 and we've heard the bird do that a bunch of times. If Bloodraven was speaking through this bird and wanted to get Jon's attention, it's a pretty weak attempt. Like, we've seen him say provocative things, and he doesn't do it here. So that's why I didn't catch it, because this is just kind of light. Anyway, I'm wondering about that. Another small but important detail, considering guest right, Bowen is a Northman, and when they have this meeting, Bowen does not drink. Bowen does not accept food or drink, and Othel Yarwick does, sort of to show us the dichotomy. And Othel Yarwick, as far as we know, is not involved in the stabbing. We pointed that out way, way back. But, of course, Bowen clearly is. So it's clear that he's, thinking about the murder, but we don't know, or that it's a possibility, but he doesn't necessarily know when it's going to happen. Now, let me go back to Borok and Melisandre. Jon is very interesting in that he's one of the few examples of characters that reject power. Even Dany doesn't do that. Ned Stark does. Stannis certainly is bought into power by Melisandre, and partially, like, her power is something that he can't turn down, that he needs. We just saw Victarion do the same thing with Makoro. Maybe Dany will later, but so far, everything she's done is taking on responsibility and power. So that's not a negative comment I'm making, just sorting things out here. Even the power of R'hllor amidst the BWB and Thoros, like, they're following an undead champion, an undead lord, and now a dead lady. Even Ned Stark didn't refuse to be hand, although he was capable of it and considerate of it. So he had the discipline to do it. He just didn't. Because that decision for him came down to what was best for his family, not best for him. It seems they were wrong, probably, but whatever, alternative futures. Let's not forget our recurring maxim, though. It could always be worse. Just because it went bad for Ned doesn't mean it couldn't have been worse if the alternate path had been taken. Another example, accepting the Crown of the North may not have been the wisest move for Robb Stark, but I doubt he even considered refusing it. We don't know. And Jon, same thing's going to happen. I don't think Jon will refuse the Crown of the North, although he's probably going to want to. He may refuse the Iron Throne, though. That's one that we'll see. So this is maybe building up to that. This may not be the first time that Jon refuses power. So that's kind of neat. It's a recurring theme with him that is not nearly as present in other arcs. So he's not accepting Melisandre when Stannis did, and Makoro is being accepted by Victarion. He's also in one of the few places in the world where his family ties mean little, meaning his Stark birth doesn't do a lot for him. It does a few things for him. And he wouldn't leverage that a whole lot anyway. He rejected Winterfell, too, when Stannis offered it to him. So this is a guy that has rejected titles and honors and power several times, really. And he embraces being a bastard, though. He embraces the other side of it. Partly because Tyrion taught him that, and that lesson worked. It seemed prescient at the time. It has played out that way. And the trappings of power. That's what we've been talking about all along. That's one of his deep connections to Melisandre in that debate there. And it gets him killed here. If he had his wolf with him, if he had his escort with him, if he was walking around like a Lord Commander normally does, they wouldn't have been able to do what they did, quite possibly. They wouldn't have had the opportunity. He, in a sense, gave them a chance they would have never had by trying to be humble. And as Melisandre says, that kind of humility is in itself a form of arrogance. And here we see the cost of that arrogance.
The Night's Watch will make for Hardhome. I ride to Winterfell alone, unless... Jon paused. Is there any man here who will come stand with me?
Yeah, so that's the line, the powerful, awesome, rah, line that happens in the Shield Hall. Shield Hall is super cool, but it's not super cool. It was super cool. It's a really emotional moment, right? It's up there where we just mentioned Robb, and it's similar to the King of the North moment when people just explode with loyalty and readiness. But this quote is a mixture of expert and naive. The expert was that part, winning them over. Tormund claps him on the back and says, "Great job. That was a good speech." But the naive part is how he frames things. First of all, he doesn't even think of Selyse. He announces to everyone that Stannis is dead, that the Queen's men and Melisandre are just standing there, and as far as he knows, they don't know this yet, and they probably don't, unless Melisandre's like seen it somehow. But they're just like, wait, what? Stannis is dead, and this is how we find out? And Jon thinks, I should have told Selyse first before announcing this. So that was a bit of an oversight. But the bigger oversight is how he frames this. In his mind, he thinks, I'm not sure if this counts as breaking my vows, but just in case, I'm not going to bring anyone else along without, them consenting. I'm not going to order anyone because then they'd be breaking their vows too. But all he has to do is say, look, Ramsay's threatening me. I'm Lord Commander. I'm part of the Night's Watch. This isn't in getting ourselves involved in the quarrels of the realm. This is the realm coming at us, threatening us. I think he could make a strong argument that he's not breaking his vows, but he's just so like his father figure, that he knows in his own mind that he's doing this for Arya, for his family. That's the real kicker here. It's not Bolton threatening him. He can handle that. It's not Stannis' death. That sucks, but he can handle that too. It's the thing about Arya. It's that she's out there. The letter says she gets away and that Ramsay is chasing her. And Ramsay assumes she's there. We'll get into why in a minute, but that's really, I think, of all the reasons Jon has here, that's the one that really gets him moving. It's Arya. It's not, he didn't make this move for Winterfell, the title for the land, but the family member, absolutely. That's the kind of person Jon is. So he could make that argument that the Night's Watch is threatened and it has to defend itself, but he doesn't do that because in his mind, he knows that's not really why he's acting. He's not willing to even lie a little bit. But he leans fully into the consequences, even not sure that he's breaking the rules. He basically declares, I'm breaking the rules. But in his mind, he's not actually sure he's doing that. And I just don't know why you would do that, Jon. But he does. He's such a good guy. He can't help but be a good guy. A little more about the Shield Hall. I don't want to leave that behind. Love versus duty, family versus duty. That's part of what this is. Jon's, instead of love in a romantic way, it's love of family, and that's what's driving him a lot here. And as Joe writes, this is the Jon problem concentrated into one paragraph. Family or duty. It wasn't honor, it wasn't ambition or duty. It wasn't Jon's self or duty, because Jon always chooses duty. But when it's family or duty, it really is a tough choice. Remember the thing that caused him to shirk his duties in the first book? He left because he heard that his father was killed and Robb was now king and fighting a war. He wanted to go assist his brother in that and to help them get revenge for the killing of Ned. Family came first for him then. And then after that, he'd already decided not to get involved. So as things progressed with Robb's campaign, he stuck to his decision. But now this is a whole new situation with Arya. So the Shield Hall. Let's see. Where was I? Yeah, George takes some time to detail the history of the Shield Hall, and Nina likens it to Camelot, which is, I think, a great way to compare it. A place set apart for knights, because that's originally what it was. It was a place for knights of the Night's Watch to have their own gathering spot, and they would hang their shields up there. And when one of them died, the shield would be burned on their pyre with them. So there's not this big collection of shields in there. I think some people get the impression it's just filled with shields, but there's 10 shields in there now. It's described as less than a dozen because all those knights have died and then they haven't been replaced. There's not current knights.
Aziz has almost as many. He has 7 shields on our wall.
I have my own shield wall building. You should check our social media for examples of that. I think I've posted it on my Instagram before.
Yeah, 7. I just counted again.
It's at Azizel Frets. That's my Instagram. Azizal frets, like guitar frets. And where was I? Yeah, so the Camelot impression is, of course, because it's a place for knights to gather and a place for only knights. And from this room, they're issuing this proclamation of fighting for their family and fighting against evil. Bolton is a monster. Like, Bolton is very much an Arthurian evil knight figure, like maybe not a Mordred, but something. He would fit into that story pretty well as an obvious villain, because he's a rare example of someone who isn't that gray as a character. Even Ramsay has a little bit of gray to him, but he's about as dark gray as they get. So, also, while he's describing the sigils, we can't let this fly by. Notable sigils like the Checky Lion and the Spider, who are mentioned together, and that's a straight nod to the Sworn Sword. That is the contest that we see in that Dunk and Egg story. It's the Checky Lion versus the Spider. He also mentions dragons and griffins, rather important at the moment. Yeah, so many others, like lions, or like wolves and bears and flayed men and all that. But yeah, like I said, it's almost a fake out because he describes it all. It sounds amazing. Then before he tells you that, oh, there's only about 8 or 10 shields there now, though. It's like, oh, wait, I thought we were describing what it currently looked like. Dang it. So it's kind of a neat little trick by George. He's like, oh, look at all the glory that's long gone. It hasn't been here for a while. And during the scene, during the speech that Jon is giving, 2 Queen's men come in, and then Melisandre, so that we are sure that they hear this news from the Pink Letter. And Othel Yarwick is there, standing with his builders, but one of his builders is not with him. That one builder is Alf of Runnymud, and Alf of Runnymud is standing with Bowen Marsh. Bowen Marsh, also with Alf, has Wick Whittlestick and Left Hand Lou. Those are the 4 that do the stabbing. And we talked about their motivations in advance. Real quick, Bowen's, Wicks is the food manager guy down below the Wormways, and he has not been pleased with Jon's orders. And Alf of Runnymud, of course, is perhaps the most angry of all, because he probably blames Jon for getting his lover killed, which we covered at the time, back when Jon sent his 3 groups of 3 out. The same time that he sent out Alistair Thorne, who also, of course, hasn't returned either. So pretty much a straight up blood debt there, I think, in Alf's case. What else do I have here? So talk about some ideas at least about this fallout. We can't possibly predict it all. I'm not even going to try to go through all the different permutations of how the different ways people could react. Way too many moving parts. We got Queen's men. We got Melisandre specifically. We got the Queen specifically. We got 1-1. We got Leathers, who is standing there, right there, talking to 1-1 when Jon is stabbed. We got the rest of the free folk. We've got individuals like Borak, the Skin Changer, and Sorin Shieldbreaker, who notably pledged himself to Jon, not to the Night's Watch, and now Jon is stabbed. So what is the extension of that? I pledge myself to you, you get stabbed. Am I supposed to immediately go after the people that stabbed you? Maybe? Yeah? I think so. Quite possibly. So, but do we know that's going to happen? So it's really, really, really hard to predict and really hard to understand and figure it all out. And even drawing like models of all the possibilities, it's just impossible. That's why I said, unlike the other battles and unlike the other climaxes in the other chapters, this is by far the hardest to predict. So immediately leaving the shield hall is when he hears the sound of screaming and roaring. The roaring, of course, is 1-1. The screaming is Patrick. So again, I repeat the amazing trope inversion here. Normally it's a giant stealing a princess and the knight saves them. Here we have the opposite. It's the giant was defending the princess against the knight's attempt to steal her. Now, I told you all that this scene has its own Azor Ahai themology to it, just as the Dragontamer and Kingbreaker chapters teamed up to do. So let's go through that. The Azor Ahai bits start off with, when the red star bleeds, well, Patrick's sigil is a star and his cloak is soaked with blood. So that's the red star bleeding. Then we have this line, Bowen Marsh stood there before him, tears running down his cheeks. So there's your salt. Here's the next part.
Jon fell to his knees. He found the dagger's hilt and wrenched it free. In the cold night air, the wound was smoking.
Smoking? That's odd. It's not steam, it's smoke, which may be a little reference to Jon's Valyrian blood or something like that. But either way, that's our salt and smoke. Now, he doesn't he's not reborn here, but the prophecy says to be reborn to wake dragons from stone, or shall be reborn to wake dragons from stone. Anyway, he's not reborn here, but he probably will be. I don't know about how he's going to wake dragons from stone. That part I'm not so sure about, but that's going to be later. Jon will probably ride a dragon. I don't know if that counts as a waking one, but somehow or another, that part's not fulfilled yet, I don't think. Surely he's going to be a different man, though. So like a metaphorical rebirth is even just the part about being dead is that works. But we've already talked about him going into Ghost, a la what we learned through Second Life Expectations in Varamir's chapter. So here's another quote.
Ghost, he whispered. Pain washed over him. Stick them with the pointy end. When the third dagger took him between the shoulder blades, he gave a grunt and fell face first into the snow. He never felt the fourth knife, only the cold. So he either didn't feel the fourth knife because his body is already flying to Ghost. I don't know what word to use. Flying, drifting, transferring, downloading. But he immediately thinks to go like that. He says Ghost as he's being stabbed. And it's pretty clear that that's got a important resonance here. But he thinks of stick them with the pointy end. He thinks of Arya, which is another reminder that that's what was on his mind most of all. It was so important to him, was protecting her above all else. Because as he's dying here, or realizes he's dying, he's not thinking of himself. He's thinking of her, and that's who he was trying to save. And maybe now he's like, oh no, who's going to take care of this for her now? Who's going to help her? And of course, this is very similar to Robb. Again, very similar, scarily similar. Of course, we don't actually experience it through Robb's POV that way, but a lot of fandom ink has been spilled on what that would have been like, and this is by far the best comparison. It's the outline for building on those possibilities. For imagining Robb, you use Jon. So again, we have these thoughts that are similar to these last few characters, where they're very much about duty. They're very much about willing to sacrifice themselves, even if they don't properly understand the dangers. They're accepting of dangers regardless. If they did perceive the dangers properly, they still would face them. They might do it a little differently. But Quentin was explained over and over how dangerous what he's doing is doing, and he went forward with it. Jon was told over and over to be wary of this, wary of that. Didn't keep his men around him. Didn't pay attention. Why did they stab him, though? What was their motivation? There's a lot of reasons. It's not just one. First of all, it's the opportunity. No ghost, no escort. The trappings of power bit. We covered that. The hard home suicide mission, though, that's a big deal. And they don't want that to happen. The broken vows repeatedly. Him finally saying straight up, I'm breaking my vows, basically. That maybe they could have interpreted him as having done it before, but he straight out admitted it in this chapter for basically the first time. Their refusal to work with the free folks, causing all sorts of friction. They would like to end that problem. They're not happy with him keeping corpses. There's just all these things. This is so many things. The reasons are overwhelming. I just mentioned Soren saying, my axe is yours, Jon Snow. They don't like that either. They don't like some random free folk leader pledging himself to the Lord Commander outside the jurisdiction of the Night's Watch. That's like building a private army or something. It's not supposed to happen. So there's just all these things that are actual rules and implied rules, cultural traditions he's breaking, etc. Let's see. A couple of y'all pointed out this same thing here, and I think it's a great sign how attentive you all are for little details like this. The bit where Jon is criticizes Selyse internally for kissing her daughter on the non-grayscale cheek. It's not hard for me to imagine that that's just the way that it should go. I mean, grayscale makes you numb in that spot, so I could see Shireen being like, I can't feel that when you kiss me there. I would like to feel it when you kiss me. You know, and Selyse may have figured that out on her own. So, yeah, Selyse is kind of crappy, but this is, I think, a great example of showing Jon's state of mind here. Jon is blaming people and frustrated, and he's lashing out a bit. There's little signs like this that he's narrow-minded about what's happening. Yeah, I mean, if she really cared, she wouldn't kiss her at all.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Good point. So he's being too harsh on Selyse. There's plenty of reasons to be harsh on Selyse, but this one is probably unfair. And it serves as a great example for the springboard to showing Jon's state of mind. Okay. Pink letter. Let's talk about that. Nina thinks Ramsay. Joe doesn't super weigh in personally and says the reason the letter stands out is that it gets across a lot of important information and how information is important in this style of society. Meaning the way information flows, meaning how easy it is to lie, to deceive through letters. That's even pointed out here. Tormund, not a man of letters, still realizes that point. He's like, look, I can say whatever I want with a pen. I mean, Tormund already does that with his mouth. So he's very well aware of that. He's like, I've lied a bunch of times, and a lot of those lies stick because no one can disprove them. So he's very aware of that concept of dishonesty and deception and how it can work and how people can easily believe. They're often going to believe the first thing they hear. If they hear two versions of a story, it's usually the one they hear first that they go with. But there's other things that catch his eye, like Mance? Wait, Mance is alive? What's that all about? Like, we saw him burn, and his reaction is somewhat muted. Jon's like, that was sorcery, a glamour. And Tormund's like, oh, okay. I mean, this guy's seen the others. It's not like magic is going to throw him off too much. Illusion is pretty mild compared to The Walking Dead, after all. So, yeah, let's put it that way. One reason that Nina puts forth that I very much agree with from a literary perspective why it needs to be Ramsay, because it shows the consequences of Jon's actions. His sympathetic goals as Lord Commander are basically aiding Stannis, wanting Stannis to win, to come out over the Boltons, saving Arya, and of course, saving being a good Lord Commander, protecting the Watch. This is what actually happens here. So the Hardhome is a disaster, full stop. It's the full extent of its disastrousness hasn't come yet, but it definitely is awful. Now, virtually every one of Jon's plans has gone not just wrong, but badly wrong. And they look bad for Jon, even though we know there's extenuating circumstances. On the outside, it just looks like he's a bad Lord Commander to a lot of people. And you can disagree with that, but you have to accept that that's the case for a lot of people. I'm not even talking about readers. I mean characters in the story. So this is part of why, if it's a trick, if it's Mance, this is like this theme is just completely lost. Jon's actions towards Mance don't have anything to do with this. Jon agreed to this plan to send Mance to infiltrate and rescue Arya, but it didn't lead to this. It didn't lead to the Hardhome disaster. It didn't lead to Arya being in this position in the first place. It's just another thing that went wrong. It didn't work out. It does. One thing about it that has gone very much awry is that it gives the Boltons a reason to come after Jon. And part of the reason that is the case is we have to break this down a little bit. But before we get to that, another thing that Ramsay is doing here is styling himself Trueborn, Lord of Winterfell, saying it's probably a slap in the face to Jon. It's a weird thing to say. He's definitely not the Trueborn Lord of Winterfell. Like, for one thing, he's a legitimized bastard, and he certainly wasn't a Stark. So it's the kind of thing Ramsay would do. Now, is Mance capable of duplicating that attitude? Yeah, maybe. He's certainly hung around Ramsay a bit. Abel's been at Winterfell for a while. He's gotten the measure of the man. But the reason is not settled. The reason I also lean Ramsay, but I'll tell you why. The reason it's such a debated topic, though, is that no matter how you look at it, even if you settle on Ramsay, there's something that looks like it doesn't fit. And the same thing happens if you settle on Mance. There's just things that look like they don't fit. No matter what answer you go with, something kind of dangles. Like, for example, let's say it is Ramsay. Then why is there no talk about the handwriting? All these other letters Jon got from Ramsay had all this talk about his signature and signing in blood. There's nothing like that here. Why is that? Did George just abandon that? Why did he do all that if he wasn't going to put it here? Does Melisandre really not know that the man wearing the slave master bracelet, the person on the other end of that, is being tortured? Does she really not feel that? Does she have no clue at all that this has happened? Maybe, but still, it's a small issue to think about. And then there's the letter, the wording, the phrase "Black Crow" is used. That's pretty much only said by free folk. Sure, Ramsay could be using that as an insult. He knows that they say that. After all, he just tortured a bunch of free folk girls, and maybe they use that phrase, so he's just duplicating it. He knows it's an insult, so he's throwing it around. Certainly, Ramsay likes to throw insults around. So let's look at it the other way. For Mance, what if it's Mance? Isn't it a bit wild for Mance to have evaded capture, even as his 6 Spearwife companions were captured? And he sent a letter? How did he know which cage had the Castle Black ravens in it? If he wrote a letter and sent it to Castle Black, wouldn't Ramsay know and could send his own letter afterwards? Or maybe Ramsay doesn't know what the letter said, but he could torture it out of him. He could say, tell me what was in that letter. It's one thing to imagine that Mance wrote a letter and got a raven off carrying that letter with the specific pink wax while not being captured. It's another thing to add on top of that stack of unlikely things that he also got away after doing that. And it would be one thing for him to do that if the castle was quiet. But Theon escaped with Jane, and the Spearwives were all helping, and so the whole castle knows what's going on. Also, why would Mance want to drag the free folk? Why would he want to lure them to Winterfell? They can't capture it. There's not enough of them to take the castle. They just die. It's like what Justin Massey's saying is like, no, you would die. They don't even know how to build siege towers, and Justin Massey thinks that wouldn't be enough. Mance cares about his people. We have seen that. That seems to be a genuinely true thing. So I don't think he would lure them to a hopeless battle where they just get slaughtered. There's also a case for Stannis himself. He has a captured maester. We know he's aiming to be tricky and fake his death. This is tricky. Tricking the free folk south could have him effectively join his army, but the timing is terrible on this. He's been sitting there at this Crofters village for a while, and there's already an army on the march towards him. The free folk won't get there in time. Maybe he needs their help taking the castle. Okay, that might be the case. But he's already been warned about why it's a bad idea to bring free folk through these lands because the Northerners will hate them. What changed? Nothing. Nothing changed. So it doesn't necessarily work out so well. Also, Theon is wrong when he tells Stannis in his Winds of Winter chapter that Ramsay is coming. Ramsay does not come. Ramsay stays back at Winterfell with his father. It's the Freys and the Manderleys that come, not the Boltons. Stannis also doesn't know, bigger problem, Stannis doesn't even know that there's this big free folk army at the wall. When he left, those people were all on the other side still. Jon brought them over, and Stannis has no idea this has even happened. So how can he be luring an army south he doesn't know exists? Yeah, big problem there. Stannis faking out the Boltons with his captured maester makes more sense than faking out the wall, because especially since the birds that maester has are trained to go to Winterfell. And as we talked about last time, he has Arnulf Karstark captured and with his son and grandsons as hostages, and he knows Karstark was going to turn on him. So he can use Karstark as a cat's paw, send Karstark to Winterfell, telling the Boltons that he won, and using Lightbringer as proof, which is in the letter. He says he has Lightbringer. That would explain that. It also makes sense that Ramsay would expect Theon and Jane to be with Stannis. That's why this chronology works out this way. For example, if Ramsay is told he's won the battle by Arnulf Karstark and is given the sword as proof, he'd be like, well, where's Reek? Where's my bride then? He would have expected them to be with Stannis. So he's like, oh, where would they go instead if they're not with Stannis? Well, the wall, to Jon Snow. That's a very straightforward conclusion. If they're not with Stannis, they must have gone to Jon Snow. So personally, I think Ramsay fits way better because the flaws, and there are flaws with choosing him, they seem easier to explain away than these larger flaws with Stannis and Mance's theories, and let alone some of the other theories that I didn't bother with because we don't have infinite time. Also, the factors seem to align better with Ramsay's behavior than with Mance's circumstances, which seem to be captured. So, yeah. So that's, I hope that's a pretty good breakdown. The Pink Letter is one of the most debated topics in all of A Song of Ice and Fire, especially if you just narrow it down to just the Dance of the Dragons. So if you want more on it, we talk about it in the Battle of Ice, but there's lots of other breakdowns on other channels as well, other podcasts, blogs. Like I said, so you go looking for it, you'll find it. It's everywhere. Okay. So yeah, again, it's sad that the Night's Watch. I feel for Bowen Marsh. You know, it's. I don't agree with him, but those tears running down his face really show that he didn't want to do this. That he hates that it came to this. And it's certainly not about ambition. It's definitely about what he believes is best for the Watch. And well, we can only wait to see what happens because I don't think it's going to be the best for him. I think he just stabbed a man that has a lot of loyal people fired up and ready for blood. And one was loyal to Jon, probably. Leather. There's just so many people that could come right after him. Interestingly, when we Twitter polled y'all on the pink letter, Twitter said Ramsay, but when we polled YouTube, Mance. So interestingly, YouTube is a little more on the tinfoil side, I guess. And I don't use tinfoil to be denigrating, be clear on that. Just I think it's less likely. So you guys are kind of picking the underdog theory, in my opinion. Here's a line. Jon thinks Arya never tore her doll to pieces, though, and that's when he's thinking about 1-1 tearing Sir Patrick to pieces. Well, Jon, you're not quite right about that. You're technically right, but she did tear someone else's doll apart, so that's why it's technically right, because it wasn't her doll. And it's in a chapter where we talked about there's a lot of vibes about giants and using giants as builders, because that's what Sandor is employed as in that chapter near the end of A Storm of Swords. If Roose is dead already, too, wouldn't Ramsay call himself Lord of the Dreadfort also? As some people brought that point up in our comments and our social media platforms. Yeah, maybe he might. It's certainly floated the theory that Roose is already dead, and that's got to be possible. But the reason he might not call himself Lord of the Dreadfort is, well, one, maybe Roose isn't dead yet. That's an obvious possibility. Two, if Roose is dead, he might not want it to be known that there's friction in the Bolton ranks. Like if Roose is dead, that's not good for the Boltons. Like someone on the outside, that's not good for their morale. If there's infighting, if it implies that Ramsay not off to Roose, that's not good. It doesn't look. It's not a strong thing to say, you know. So we started off this chapter by describing all the various things that come to a head, but clearly you can't possibly resolve them all. It's definitely a cliffhanger ending, the first of 3 in a row. The next 2 endings being plague corpses hurled at Meereen as war resumes, and then Dany facing down Khal Jocko at the end of her chapter. After that, we have Kevin slayed by Varys, which isn't really a cliffhanger, but an assassination. Gives that chapter a major thing in common with this one, in a different way. Of all the cliffhanger endings, though, this one is the hardest to predict, like I've been saying. I'm fascinated by thoughts of what will happen next. I'm confident Dany's not going to die to Khal Jocko, though, nor will her armies lose these battles, I don't think, at least not in the short term. Stannis is probably going to win the Battle of Ice, too, as I've said. After that, though, we'll see. There's just so many factions, so much chaos. The Free Folk are not one unit. So, again, I know I've probably been repetitive on these points, but I just can't say enough about how excited I am to see how this chaos resolves itself. George has so many choices on how to tell this story, but for all we know, he's got it completely settled in his mind. He's like, oh no, I know exactly what I'm going to do here. The truth is probably somewhere in between that, but we'll see. We'll see. So what will these characters do? What's Melisandre going to do? What's Tormund going to do? What's Borok going to do? What's Satin going to do? What's Bowen Marsh going to do next? What's Leathers going to do next? And you, what are you going to do next? Next.
I'm going to stand up.
Yeah. It was a long episode today. Thank you everyone for attending, for sticking through it. We had a lot to cover today. It was 154 minutes, 37 seconds of audiobook time. Last week it was 148.50, so pretty close. Only about 5 minutes difference. But a lot more was said today, I suppose. This episode's going to be a bit longer. As usual, you can check the podcast version and the video version to see the rough difference between the two. Usually something like 10 to 20 to 20, 25 is probably about as much as ever cuts out. That's a lot. 25 minutes to cut out is a lot. Sometimes you cut out like a billion things as an editor, and it adds up to like 20 seconds.
Yeah. Sometimes you cut out me laughing juvenilely at something.
I cut out myself laughing too. A lot, because I laugh a lot, and it gets to be too much when you're listening to it. meaning when I'm
And
listening
when
to
you're
myself.
sitting next to it.
Yeah, that too. Yeah. Tough but fair. Tough but fair. So we've gone through 2780 of the 2922 minutes. That's 95.1%. 1 week left. 3 chapters left. Don't forget to like the video and leave a review. Hit that subscribe button. Leave, whether you watch on YouTube or a podcatcher, you'd be surprised at how much those algorithms are tweaked by y'all adding your 2 cents. We mentioned or alluded to a lot of our scripted content, as often is the case. In recent episodes, I've said soon we'll have When Giants Roam to add to the list, but now it's the case. When Giants Roam is out. That's our collab with Amanda / Crowfood's daughter. There'll be more of those down the line. And of course, with a giant participating in today's episode, we have some things to say about that. Summer Hall came up. Our Summer Hall episodes are a great way to delve into the things Barristan was talking about, as well as the history of Aegon V and Sir Duncan and Duncan the Small. Our Blackwood episodes were referenced. We mentioned Melantha and Betha, Blackwood, yeah, as well as Bloodraven. And we mentioned our Blackfire series. That seems to come up about almost every episode. But it was particularly heavy today with all the talk about the Gold Company, the Second Sons, and all these different historical incidents. House Dayne was mentioned. The Dayne stuff. Our Dayne 2 episode covers the characters, but we also have a Dayne episode on the history of them. We talked about House Royce today somewhat. If you want more on Laura Royce, the mother of all those Starks and the She-Wolves of Winterfell, we spend a good bit of time on that in the Royce episode. Next time, we have The Queen's Hand, Return of the Harpy, a.k.a. a catapulting of corpses.
Daenerys 10, Return to the Dothraki Sea, a.k.a. Berry Bad Dreams.
Yep, she eats some berries and gets sick and has some cool dreams.
Yes, that's Berry as in Berry, not B-A.
Yeah, not Barristan's bad dreams. An epilogue. Return of the Spider, a.k.a. the one that manages to talk about every single plot line. It's such an amazing epilogue. As you can see, a bit of a theme with Return of the Harpy, Return to the Dothraki Sea, and Return of the Spider. Great way to finish off. Excited to do that. And of course, after we finish next week, we'll be moving on to the wrap-up episode. Then, like I said at the beginning of this episode, plenty more content yet to come. Scripted, live, in between, all that. Guinevere Greenstone says, what History of Westeros videos would be good to watch before next week? Oh, that's a good call. I'm not always clear on what we're going to cover before I sit down to analyze the chapters, but there's one really obvious one, which is we have a Patreon episode on the epilogue of A Dance with Dragons. It's a specific scripted episode all about Kevin. So we have new thoughts on it since that episode was made before the end of the show, before Fire and Blood, and just we have new thoughts on it. But that's a pretty straightforward one. Also, maybe... I'm not sure about what else. The Barristan chapter, certainly I would suggest our Barristan content would be good. Maybe if you haven't checked out Duskendale, that still is relevant. Or A White Cloak Turned is still white. That's the Kingbreaker and the Queenmaker, which is Kristen Cole. So there's a lot of good comparisons there. That's with Jeff Hartline as a guest. So those are 2 good examples there. There might be some others that I'm spacing out on. It's a humble brag to say that we have so many episodes, I can't think of them all. But it is true. We have like almost 300 episodes now. We've been doing this since 2012. So yeah, we've got a big stack. We hope you enjoy our stack. If you haven't perused the entire stack, please do. And we'll be back with more soon. Until then, Valar Rereadis. But let me issue some thanks before we get into that, before the final sign off. Thanks to Joe and Nina for their invaluable assistance. I cite them a lot, as always. Thank you to our History of Westeros mods for leading the discussions in our Facebook group. Thanks to those of you who participate on Flick and Slack and Discord as well. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld for his awesome work with the maps and our video intro. Thanks to Kevin MacLeod for our musical intro. Thank you to Joey Townsend and Jesse Koval for the music in our regular episodes. Thank you to our Bengineer for the sound quality assistance. Thank you to our patrons for the financial assistance. Most of all, we would not be here without you all. And check out, as we always do, give a shout out to Here Be Dragons. I guess they're already started, but you could catch it from the beginning. They're talking about the currently airing Marvel show, WandaVision. I personally haven't checked that out yet. I plan on it. I plan on binging it. Shay has been watching it, though.
I have been watching it, and I am an episode behind.
So she probably won't be catching Here Be Dragons just yet, since it's going to be spoiler. But if you are up to date, hit it and check out Here Be Dragons in general. Until next week, y'all. Thanks for the long episode this time. And we're near the end. Valar Rereadis.